So what is HTML? Well, technically HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. An important keyword there is markup. And what it actually is a standardized system for creating web pages. Because if you think about it, all the different websites that are out there, we need some sort of standard system that browsers can look at the code and be able to display a web page. And that's what HTML gives us. And it is focused on the structure of a web page. So HTML handles or deals with the structure. CSS deals with the presentation and the styling, and then JavaScript deals with sort of functions and functionality, animations, adding some dynamic elements to it, and so forth. So HTML uses tags to mark up a language, and that's why the markup part of this is really the key part. So what exactly does that look like? Well, here's some example source code. And what I want you to notice here, if you look, for example, at the tag that says title, you'll notice that all of these different elements, these different sort of funny looking things are essentially tags that wrap around text. So for example, you have title, then you have my first web page, and then you have essentially / title. So what this is we are adding these little snippets of code to the text on a page to mark it up and tell the browser certain things about how we want it to display this web page. So when you're creating HTML or writing HTML, this is essentially what you're doing. You are marking up the text that you put on a page and giving the browser hints or instructions about how to render this particular web page. And so if we look real quick at a sort of standard request, the way that it works is, let's say you visit a web page, for example, google.com. Well, when you do that, and you do that in your web browser, your browser sort of does all of this behind the scenes work to figure out, when you type google.com into your browser, to figure out what computer it needs to connect to in order to display that web page. And so it figures that out, and it actually creates a direct connection to that other computer. So when you're viewing a web page, browsing around a web page or a website, you are actually communicating directly with another computer. That computer that you're communicating with that stores the files for google.com is called the server. And you may have heard of a term called a LAMP stack or something like that. LAMP actually stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and is probably the most common web stack that's out there. And Linux would be the operating system. And of course, it's not the only one. You can have Windows operating systems for web servers as well, but Linux is probably the most common. Apache is the web server. What a web server does is, if you think about it, you are again directly connecting to another computer and you are loading files, you're requesting files off of that computer. Normally, any computer, to do that, you would have to have a username and password or have some sort of account to be able to do that. But of course, when you have millions and millions of people visiting a web page, that's very cumbersome, and you don't want to give random people that you don't know who they are, you wouldn't want to give them sort of user level access to your computer. And so what a web server software like Apache does is it handles those requests and the permissions and all that sort of thing, and the processing of code on the server side and so forth. It sort of handles all of that so that we can have this web where I can connect directly to google.com's servers and be able to load different web pages and so forth. So Apache is web server software that handles all that. MySQL, of course, is for storing data. And then PHP is a server-side language that does code processing on that side. So again, when you request a web page from, say, google.com, the web server, Apache, looks for that particular page. If it finds it, it figures out, hey, do I need to do any code processing through PHP or some server-side language? It does all of that processing before ever sending anything back to your browser. So when we talk about server-side languages, what we're talking about are languages where the code is processed by the server. And again, PHP, MySQL, Python, and a number of others that are out there that you probably heard of. Those are all considered server-side languages. They are processed by the server, and then the output, the result of that processing, is what is sent back to the client. The client receives that, and that comes in the form of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, like what we looked at on the previous page. And so it is the browser that then looks at that code that the client received and figures out how to display that code. And so that is why HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are called client-side languages, because they are processed on the client side of the equation by the browser. Okay, so again, when we're writing HTML, we are working on the client side, and ultimately the bottom line is that as a developer, you are writing code that tells a web browser exactly how to display a web page, and HTML is one of the languages that browsers understand. So you are telling a browser how to render a page when you write HTML, and ultimately that's what HTML is. We've talked about HTML as a markup language, and we use tags to do the marking up. So now let's talk about HTML tags and exactly what they are. So what an HTML tag is a tag name surrounded by less than and greater than brackets. So you can see example here of the body tag. You'll see a less than and a greater than sign, and you will see a body, the word body inside of that. So body is the name of the tags, and then we put it inside of these brackets to denote that it is an HTML tag. And of course, different tags will have different names, like a body tag, a paragraph tag, an image tag, etc. Now, normally HTML tags will consist of an opening and a closing tag, like so. So you will have a tag with the less than and greater than sign, the name of the tag inside of it, and then to close that tag, you will put a slash in front of the name of the tag. And so what this denotes to the browser, tells the browser, is that anything inside of these two tags is marked up with this specific tag, and I want you to treat it a particular way based on whatever that tag is. And so inside of here, we're denoting that it is a paragraph tag. Now this will especially come into play when you're dealing with CSS, because we can then target these tags in our CSS and tell the browsers how to style specific tags. We can give names to tags and so forth. But this is the basic structure of what most HTML tags will look like. Now, there are exceptions. There are what are called void tags, and they are called void tags because they can't have any content inside of them. So syntactically, there's no reason for them to close because there's no contents to put inside them anyway. So a really good example, a common example of that would be an image tag. This is the full image tag that you would use in your HTML. You'll notice inside of this, we have a attribute, which we'll talk about in a second, which is source, which tells the browser where to find the image we want to display. But you'll notice that there is no closing tag on this. It is all just the opening tag. And that's all you'll put when you use this HTML. You will not put a closing tag with the image tag. That would be considered incorrect syntax. So this is what's called a void tag, and you will see some of these throughout HTML as you learn it. Now, one thing that you may see is something that's called a self-closing tag, and these are really a leftover from XHTML. And if you're not familiar, XHTML was this flavor of HTML, and it still exists, but for a number of years it was supposed to become the default HTML, the HTML that we all know and love and use. It was to become the standard, and it was a mix of XML and HTML, and the whole idea behind it was to make HTML a more strict language that followed strict standards. That sort of fell apart, and like I said, XHTML still exists, but HTML5 has come out, and we no longer sort of follow those rules. But again, these self-closing tags are a leftover from XHTML. And again, the image tag is an example of this. And what you'll notice is that we have our image tag as before, but on the closing bracket here, we have a slash before that. And the reason that was done is because XML is a strict language and required every tag to be closed. But as I just explained, HTML has void tags where you have certain tags that don't have any need for them to be closed, and so they don't have a closing tag for them. And so sort of the compromise in XHTML was what are called these self-closing tags like this. Now, for today's HTML, this is no longer necessary unless you're going to go into XHTML and actually specifically write that sort of code. But for the normal sort of HTML, this is no longer necessary. However, you may see code out there that still has this in it, or you may see coders out there who still use this, and that will, one, give you a sign of how long they've been doing it. But it's sort of, again, just a leftover of this XHTML. So something you don't need to use, but again, if you see it, don't get freaked out by it. You can simply remove that closing slash and use it like a normal HTML tag. All right, so let's talk about attributes. So HTML tags can have attributes that further describe how the element should be displayed. And so the basic structure of the attributes is as follows. So you have the name of the tag, and then you'll have a space, and then you'll have the name of the attribute, an equal sign, and you can have double or single quotes, and then you will have the value of that attribute. So if we look at our image tag, this is actually a good example of that. You can see we have IMG, which is the name of our tag for image. Then we have SRC, which stands for source, and then equals and myimage.jpg. So what this does is it tells the browser for this image tag where you're going to find the image is at myimage.jpg. Now this is what's called a relative path. So the browser will look whatever URL you happen to be at. So if you're at google.com/about, and then you were to put this image tag in here, the browser would look at google.com/about/myimage.jpg for that image file. Of course, that may not be exactly how you want to structure your site, so you can use what are called absolute URLs, where you actually put in the full HTTP address of the image here. And when you get into CSS, then that of course changes a little bit too. But again, the basic idea of the attribute is that you can add attributes that further tell the browser how they should display this particular tag. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about are what are called elements. And so you may have heard me use this term element as we've talked about all this. And an element is essentially the HTML tag and the content inside of it. So it is the full sort of tag. We refer to these as elements. So if you can see in the example here, we have the H1, which is a heading tag level 1. So we have that opening and closing tag. We have our content inside of that. That full tag and content is referred to as an element. So when someone says element, this is technically what they're referring to. Although you will find, and I am certainly guilty of this, that people often refer to tags and elements a bit interchangeably. But it's important to understand what an element is, again, especially when you start dealing with CSS, because when you target elements inside of CSS, that's something you'll hear a decent amount. That generally is being said in the technical sense, and we're describing not only the tag, but also the content inside of that tag. Now I want to talk about folder and file structure and naming conventions, because this will be important as you sort of go into this and making sure you have well-organized code and well-organized structure, and makes things a little bit easier to manage. And there are some sort of gotchas and pitfalls you got to watch out for when it comes to naming your files and so forth. So first I want to talk about structure. I'll walk you through a typical, probably pretty common setup when it comes to your folder and file structure. And then we'll get into some of the naming conventions. So one of the things that you'll often heard referred to is something called the root folder. Now I'm going to go ahead and name this root like this, but when someone refers to a root folder, they're not actually referring to a folder called root like this. Instead, what they're referring to is, let's say this was our project, or this was our website, and inside of this we would then, let's go ahead and open up this, and we'll create a new folder, and we might call this, say, images. Okay, so we have a structure here where we have a folder inside of another folder. Well, the folder that is all the way sort of at the bottom, it is the main one that all the other files and folders are contained inside of, is considered the root folder. And oftentimes when you upload this to your site, this will actually be, say, where your sort of root domain is. So if we rename this to, say, google.com or something like this, you know, what is immediately loaded into that main section there is going to be sort of the root folder, and then you have all of your subfolders inside of that. Okay, so we'll just call this my first web page like this, and inside of that, then we can start talking. So that's our root folder. Now we can start talking about the folders that we're going to have inside of that. And oftentimes what you'll see is, you'll see one for images, you'll see another one for your CSS files, and you'll see another one for your JavaScript files like this. This is a pretty common setup when it comes to a web page. So you have your images, you have your CSS in one other folder, and you have your JavaScript in another, and then you would have some sort of new document like this, and let's just call this index.html. Okay, this would be a pretty common setup for a website. Now, index.html is sort of a special file, and the reason it is because whenever you could have multiple files inside of here. Let's go ahead and create another one, and we'll call this about.html, right? And these would represent all of your different web pages. Well, if you just go to, say, my first web page, what is you go to google.com, you don't necessarily specify you want to go to google.com/index.html. You just say google.com. So what the web browser does is it assumes if no file is specified, if no path is specified, it's going to just default to trying to display index.html. So index.html is sort of the default file that will be loaded for a folder. And that's true even of these subfolders like this. We may come in here and we may create a file called, or excuse me, go ahead and ignore that. We'll go ahead and create a file called style.css. Right, we may create a file like this, but that's not going to get loaded by default if someone tries to go to my first web page /CSS. And so if we were to come in here and we were to create a new document called index.html like this, that would still be the default file, even though it's our CSS folder. And if someone tries to browse this folder, they will get this index.html file. Now, that is actually a best practice when we talk about building out our file and folder structure, because if you don't have this index.html file, oftentimes what will happen is the server will return and display a list of all of the files inside of the folder that is clickable. Well, if you don't want someone, a potential hacker, seeing how all of your files are stored on your server, then you wouldn't want them to be able to see that list. So adding this index.html file and just leaving it blank is sort of a best practice for security when it comes to websites. Okay. So again, this is a pretty standard, I would say, folder structure. You have your images, you have your CSS, you have your JavaScript, and then your individual pages, your home page, which would be index.html, your about page, your contact.html, and so forth, would all be sort of right here in your root folder, so that when someone goes to your website, they just have to go to yourwebsite.com/about.html, not slash, the name of a folder, the name of another folder, then /about.html. That would be sort of difficult to get to. Now, another thing that you'll notice that I've sort of been doing as I've done this is you'll notice that I'm using all lowercase and I'm using no spaces. Uppercase, it sort of depends on the browser and so forth and the setup, but if you use uppercase, they're mostly case sensitive. URLs are mostly case sensitive. So if you had, for example, if we renamed this to a capital about.html like this, and someone typed in a lowercase, they would get an error that page couldn't be found. So it's best practice to, and of course having to remember that this is uppercase and all that sort of thing is just extra that your site visitors are going to have to do. So the standard is to keep everything lowercase, and also things like, if we were to, let's go ahead and do a new document here. If we were to do something like contact and then do a space, if I could spell here, contact space like this, and yeah, it's even having trouble saving it here, but contact space .html like this, that's opens up, there's a potential for problems with this. So the way that you handle this, you don't want to do that. That is sort of a big no-no. So the way that you handle this is either you put it all together like this, or you can use underscores like this, or you can use dashes like this. But we don't want to have any spaces in both our file names or our folder names. Your best bet is to keep these things as simple as possible, because again, you have people, oftentimes it'd probably be people who maybe aren't as tech savvy who are trying to visit your website, and so the less they have to remember to capitalize or put a dash or this, that, the other, the easier it is for them to be able to find stuff, and easier it is going to be for you to remember. And most of the other sites that they're going to visit are going to be structured and have their names work this way as well, so they're going to be used to it. So again, all lowercase, no spaces. Generally want to avoid special characters except for underscores and dashes and things like that. So that is file and folder sort of structure and naming conventions and so forth. Last thing then, before we get into writing some actual code here, is talking about some of the code editors and tools out there that you can use for development. Now, by far the most common thing that I get asked whenever I do these classes and tutorials is, what text editor or what software am I using? So I'm going to tell you what I'm using, but it's probably not what I would recommend for you, especially if this is your first sort of foray into coding. I'll show you what I started out using, the very first piece of software I used all those years ago. So, but to talk about what I'm using, what this is right here, what you're looking at is a software called Cloud9. Now, Cloud9 is what's called a cloud IDE. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. And what an integrated development environment tries to do is try to bring all of the stuff that you need for development under one roof, or sort of one application. So as you can see it here, it says it lets you write, run, and debug your code, in this case of a cloud IDE within just a browser. You also have desktop IDEs like, for example, NetBeans. I think Eclipse is one as well, where these are actually software you download and install on your computer. And again, they try to bring all of it sort of under one roof. And and then the cloud version of that, of course, a cloud IDE is one that is hosted in the cloud. You don't have to download it. You just create an account, sign into an account, and you access it through your web browser. I like these because no matter what computer I'm using, I can just simply log into my account and all of my code as I left it is right there. There's no syncing or any of that sort of thing. It's all just in one account, and I can access it from anywhere. I don't even have to access it from my own computer. So it's really handy in that sense. However, again, if you're just starting out into coding, this can be a little bit sort of overkill, and it can probably make things a little bit harder because you're now trying to figure out this really robust piece of software along with learning the language, when there's a lot simpler stuff out there that you can sort of start out on. And once you get sort of comfortable with coding and using the software, then you can sort of upgrade into one of these. Now, if you do want to go the Cloud IDE route and you want to just go all in, I personally right now don't think that I would recommend Cloud9. I'm sort of in a unique position because I already have an account. You'll see we have this login for existing Cloud9 customers. And so I'm logging into an interface that I'm familiar with, that I've been using, and I like the way it was before. But Cloud9 was bought out by Amazon, and now in order to use it, you have to create an instance inside of their whole system. I forget the name right off the top of my head, an EC2 instance, and all of this extra stuff that, again, if you're just new to coding, that in and of itself could be really, really difficult. So one that's out there that might be a little simpler, that's a Cloud IDE, is Code Anywhere. It's a little bit more like what Cloud9 used to be. There's also Code Envy. You could really just Google Cloud IDE and see a bunch of different options out there. And what I would suggest is just trying them. Most of these are going to have some sort of free option like this. So try the free option, mess around with a couple different ones, and figure out which one you want if you want to go to Cloud IDE route. But what I would recommend to you if you are absolutely brand new to this is actually a piece of software called Notepad++. And the reason is because Notepad++ is just sort of a code editor. It doesn't have all of that other stuff inside of it. And it's actually really handy. It has syntax highlighting. It has some useful stuff, like you'll see right here, you have the save, but then you'll see these multiple save. It actually will save every file that you have open. It has sort of some find and replace and undo and things that are a little bit better than just sort of your standard Notepad, but aren't as complicated as a full IDE. So if you're brand new, I would recommend something like this. There's also Sublime Text that's out there. There's Brackets. There's Atom. Those are all fine. Again, Notepad++ is the one that I started out with, so that would be what I would recommend for you. It is a desktop software, so you download it, install it to your computer, and it works really, really well. The last thing that I want to talk about is perhaps you may have tried to do maybe mess with some PHP code and so forth before, and you'll have noticed that when you try to run that PHP code just in your browser, it doesn't render the PHP code. It actually just displays the code that you wrote in your code editor. And the reason it does that goes back to what we talked about before between the difference between a server and a client-side language. The server-side language needs that server software. It needs Apache, it needs MySQL, it needs PHP, the rendering engine. It needs all that software installed to be able to render PHP code. So if you just try to open a PHP file in your browser, it's not going to work. HTML, however, is different. So I'm going to go ahead and hit edit with Notepad++ here, and let's just put about me right here, just like this. And as a matter of fact, let's put a tag, and we'll do about me. So the strong tag is basically to make this bold. And we save that, we can actually open this straight up inside of our browser. And you'll see here, our text here is actually bolded. So because HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are client-side languages, we don't need that web server. We don't need that PHP rendering engine. We don't need that MySQL database software. We can open these files directly in our browser like this. Now, eventually, I would recommend that you get sort of a web server emulator, because if we look at some of the pathing here, if we come down here and look at the URL, you will see that you are at file//c users. And so that can be, when you get into certain parts of coding, that can become a problem. But just for learning the basics of sort of HTML and CSS, you're generally going to be okay when it comes to that sort of thing. If you do want to download a server emulator, you can use something called WAMP server. So we'll go to wampserver.com. And what a piece of software like this is going to do, let's click over to English. What a piece of software like this is going to do is it's going to essentially allow you to emulate a server. Remember, we talked about client server. It's going to allow you to emulate that on your own computer, and it will install Apache. It will install MySQL. It will install PHP, and will sort of set everything up so that you can then run files as if you were running them on an actual remote server from a hosting company or whatever. So again, it allows you to emulate that environment. So you don't need it for what we're going to do here inside of this course, but if you do want to sort of get set up with something like this, WAMP server is an option. There's another one called XAMPP. There's one called MAMP, and then of course most cloud IDEs have this built right into them, so you don't actually have to even install this software. They bring the emulator and they bring the code editor sort of all under one roof. Again, that's cloud IDEs specifically. Desktop IDEs don't necessarily do that. So again, I know there's a lot out there. At the end of the day, if all of this is super confusing to you, download Notepad++ and then just open the files in your browser and start there. And then as you get more comfortable with the coding part of things and so forth, then you can think about maybe upgrading your software and trying some of this stuff. The first thing we're going to talk about then as we get into coding is the first thing that you should have inside of all of your web pages, at least all of your HTML web pages. And that is the Doctype. Now, before I get into that, just let me give you a little bit of heads up on structure. You can see I'm using my cloud IDE here. Of course, you can go ahead and however you have yours set up, maybe it's a folder on your computer or whatever, you can do this same thing inside of there. But I have a folder called HTML, and then inside of that I have index.html. So we're going to be sort of working primarily inside of this index.html page for now. So I'm going to go ahead and close it up to give us a little bit more space. But when we talk about a Doctype, we have our opening bracket here and then an exclamation point. And again, why is it this way? I don't even necessarily know, and I don't think it really even matters. It just is how it sort of came about. But the Doctype sort of is what it sounds like. So you're going to write Doctype, and then you're going to tell it what type of document it is. So in this case, for HTML, we're just going to write HTML and we're going to close it. And that's it. Now, I would say 90% of the web pages you build, that's what it's going to be. Because with HTML5 and the way things are now, you just have to tell the browser, hey, we're using HTML. It used to be, again, when we had XHTML and so forth, you would have a Doctype declaration that looks something like this. So let me go ahead and drop this in here. And you can see there's a lot more to this one. But essentially, it was saying, hey, we're using HTML, but we're using this specific version, HTML 4.01. And here is the where you can find sort of the declaration for what that standard is supposed to be. Now, in this case, this would be 4.01 strict. And there was also one, which is probably the most common one back when I was learning how to code, which was the transitional one. And so this is 4.01 transitional. You can see it's at loose.ddt. So you may, as you're, again, looking at code and reviewing different code out there, you may see some of this. Most of this was, again, when we were sort of looking at XHTML and we're going to make the transition from HTML to XHTML, these things all cropped up. But because of the way all that went and sort of we moved away from X to HTML, again, 90% of the time, I would say 99, probably 99.9% of the time, the web pages you build are going to be HTML documents. They're going to be HTML5 documents since it's the most current version. And so you're just going to do Doctype HTML like this, and that's all you really have to worry about. Now let me get into the basic structure of a web page, and this is essentially how every web page that you're going to create when it comes to HTML is going to be structured. So the first thing is what we already covered, which is the Doctype here. This is going to be first in every web page. It needs to be first, and it needs to be in every web page. So just keep that in mind. And this Doctype is not considered an HTML tag. It's considered a declaration, so it's not actually a HTML tag. So our first HTML tag is actually the HTML tag. So essentially what's happening here is we're telling the browser, hey, this page is going to be an HTML page, and then now we're saying, here's our HTML. So all of your HTML code is going to be contained inside of this HTML tag. And then inside of this, you're going to have two main tags. You're going to have a head tag, and you're going to have a body tag. And this right here is sort of the basic structure of every web page that you're going to build. Now, what is the head tag and what is the body tag? The head tag is essentially things that are about the document or resources you're going to load, like a style sheet or a JavaScript file, etc., that are not going to be visually displayed on the actual page itself, whereas the body is where you're going to have all the things that people will actually see when they visit your page. So the head allows you to describe the document, and the body is where you actually build out the page. Okay, so an example of something that you might put in the head tag is what's called a title tag. And this gives this a title for the browser, and other, when you link to it, and social media shares and so forth will often read this title. So we'll do my first web page as the title tag. Okay, and we'll save that, and then I'm going to go ahead and I come over to the browser, and let me just sort of shrink this down so you can see. But you'll see up here we have my first web page. That displays that way because of that title tag that we just set. So this is the primary place this is going to be displayed, but also, again, if this page gets shared on, say, Facebook or Twitter, it's going to look to the title to get the name of the web page. Okay, so that's what the title tag does. That's one example of the kind of information that you might put in the head tag. Now, if we come to the body, I'll do, and you'll notice on that page there's no content, right? Even though we set the title tag, it doesn't show up anywhere in the visual display. Again, that's what the head is for. Now, if we do an H1 tag like this, and we say my first, and we'll just say page, so it's different like this. And now we should be able to see that over here. You see it says my first page. And so, again, the head is for stuff that describes the document. The body is for the actual visual display. And again, Doctype, opening an HTML tag, your head section, your body section, and then closing HTML tag. This is the basic structure of virtually every HTML page that you're going to create. Now let's dive a little bit further into the head section and talk about some of the common things that you'll put in this head section here. So we've already talked about one of them, and that is the title tag. And again, that defines the title of the document, and it's required in all HTML documents. And so that'll show up in the browser tag. It'll show up for the page when it's added to favorites. It'll be the title for the page in search engine results, and so forth. So that is the first one. You can see the syntax here. It's an opening and closing title tag, and then the title that you want for the web page inside of those tags. Another common one that you will see is a link tag. And so this looks like this. It'll be something like link. And then often this is for loading style sheets. So we'll do rel, which means relationship. And we'll say that this is a style sheet because that's what it is. And then you will have href, which is the hyperlink reference. And that will be the link to your style sheet. So we'll just say, for example, style.css. Okay. And so what that's going to do is it's going to tell the browser to load this resource, and then that style sheet will be loaded in, and that style sheet will be applied to all of the tags that you have here. Now, another thing that you can do instead of loading the style sheet this way, although this isn't recommended, but just in case you run into this, but you can certainly do this, which is instead of loading a style sheet, you can actually create a style tag like this and put all of your CSS declarations inside of this style tag. Now, again, that's not recommended. because then you would, if you had multiple pages, you would have to copy that from each page into each page. And then if you wanted to make a change, you'd have to go into each page and change that CSS code in every page. And if you had 100 pages, that would get really cumbersome. And so that's why instead you link it in like this. And now we can go to style, open to style.css, make our change there, and it will be applied to all of the pages where this style sheet is loaded in. But that is the link tag. That's another common one that you're going to see in the head section. Another common one, or one that you'll definitely see, are meta tags. And so there can be a number of different meta tags that you might see. So a common one I would sort of recommend that you sort of always include would be char set, which is the character set. So this is going to tell the browser which character set to use, and UTF-8 is sort of the most common thing that you're going to see out there. And so that just tells it there's lots of different character sets out there that can be used, and depending on languages and so forth, you know, the different character sets can make sense, but UTF-8 is sort of the most common one, and so you generally want to put this at the top of all of your web pages. So that's one that you'll see. Another really common one, and one that you want to have, has to do with responsive design, and in the day and age that we live in, that of course is a huge deal. And so this one is going to be, we're going to do meta, and the name of it is going to be viewport, and content is going to be equal to width. And you can really just sort of copy this. And let me go ahead and close this so we don't run out of room here. But the content is going to be width equals, and then it's going to be device width, and then initial scale, and that is going to be equal to 1.0. Okay, and so like I said, this is for responsive design, and the viewport tag, or the viewport element here, it tells the browser how it should control the page's dimension and the scaling. So the width equals device width part, that sets the width of the page and tells it to set it to the screen width of the device. So whatever device is using it, it's saying make the width of the viewport the same as the device. Now, the reason that comes into play, or why that matters, is if you've ever been to a website where when you initially viewed it, it was really, really small, and then you could sort of zoom in with your fingers, and then it would zoom in closer and so forth. That would be a web page that does not have this meta tag in it, because what the browser is trying to do is it sees that the width of the device is maybe 640 pixels or 720 pixels or whatever, and the width of that's actually in the web page is maybe 960 or something. It's bigger than what the device is, so it tries to shrink down the website to fit on the device. What this is telling it to do essentially is to not do that. Okay, now the initial scale part sets the initial zoom level when the page is first loaded by the browser. And so it's saying we want it to be 1.0. So we want essentially it to be whatever it actually is. So what actually happens as a result of this is if you don't have this viewport tag in there, then the browser will try to manipulate and shrink and mess with the size of your web page. Whereas if you have this in there, it's going to render it at the size that is specified by your style sheet and so forth. And the reason we need that for responsive design is because we are calculating for the different viewports and the different screen sizes in our CSS code. So we don't want the browser messing with it. We want it to just display it as it is, and then we will adjust via our CSS and media queries and other stuff that we're not necessarily going to talk about now, but we will adjust it. So essentially for responsive design, you want to make sure and have this tag always be in there. That's really important. Now, some other meta tags that you might see that are probably less common here, you might see things like you might have meta and then description like this. name equals description, and then content would be something like, this is my first web page. Now, what this is supposed to do is essentially tell the browser, hey, this is the description of this page. So, and then when search engines index this page, they might use this description. You can also add a meta tag for keywords, the author, something like, those are different ones that you can add in there. You don't really see those as much because search engines tend to ignore those sorts of things. So I would say the most common sort of your default head tag would be something like this. You'd have your character set to UTF-8. You would have this your viewport set so you can have responsive design. You'd have your title tag, and you'd be linking in at a minimum a style sheet, maybe a couple style sheets, maybe a JavaScript file or two as well. But this would be sort of the minimum things that you would have inside of your head tag. Next, we're going to talk about the heading tag, and you actually will see we've already done one here. This is a heading level 1, but you can do up to 6 different levels, and I'm going to just sort of drop this in here real quick because it's repetitive. But you can see we have these 6 different heading tags. They are the letter H, and then whatever level of tag, you have the opening tag, you have the closing tag, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1 denotes the most important, and then the on down the list. 2 is the next important, 3 is the next important, and so forth. And if we take a look at this, we'll run this back up here, and we'll go to courses/HTML. You can see that by default, these actually have their own size. I haven't applied any style to this. The browser is doing all of this based off of what kind of tag it is. So heading being the most important, it's the largest. Heading level 1, heading level 6 being the least important, it is the smallest. Now, heading tags are important because search engines sort of use them to look at the structure and the content of your web pages. Users will use them, and it helps them to sort of visually move around and understand your web page. And so it's important to use headings to show your document structure and give both search engines and users hints about how they should be viewing and looking at your web pages. So headings are important. Oftentimes what you'll see, for example, is that the main, let's say take a blog page, for example, the title of that particular article or that blog post will be in an H1 tag, and then any subheadings inside of that article will be in an H3 tag often, and then sidebar elements. So if you have a sidebar, the title of the sidebar, each sort of element will often be an H3 tag. So H1 and I would say H3 are the tags you'll probably use most often. But again, you can sort of use these however to denote and mess with the structure of your site. And again, you can sort of see the default sizing that goes on here. Now you can change the sizing by adding an attribute. Style is an attribute, and you can, this is a little bit of CSS, so I don't want to get in too heavy into it, but it's pretty simple. So we can do font size, and we could do, say, 100 pixels here. Okay, so this is an attribute called style, and then inside of that, we're putting CSS, and we're saying we want the font size to now be 100 pixels instead of whatever the default is. And if we reload that, we now see that this heading tag is a lot bigger. So you can override the default styling or the default sizing that comes with these heading tags. But again, by default, they're going to sort of have their own and be structured this particular way. The next tag that I want to talk about is the paragraph tag. So let's go ahead and get rid of some of these heading tags here. And let's change this heading one to my first web page. And then we will create our paragraph tags, and they're essentially our brackets with the P tag inside of them. And you can see we have the opening and closing there, and we'll just say this is a paragraph. And so this does essentially what it says it does. It defines a paragraph. Now, a lot of this, what it comes down to, these different tags, is it comes down to default styling, and it comes down to being able to target it with CSS. So if we put these two paragraphs like this and we refresh this, you'll notice that in between here there's some space. And if we inspect this and we look at our paragraph tag here, you can see it has WebKit margin before is 1em, WebKit margin after is 1em. What that's telling us is that is the default styling that this browser gives to paragraph tags. Whereas if we look at the H1, you can see the font size is 2em, the WebKit margin before is 0.67em, the font weight is bold. This is all default styling. We have added no styling. This is the styling that the browser itself gives to these different tags. So a lot of times the difference between making a certain chunk of text an H1 tag versus a paragraph tag is the default styling that you want, and then what we sort of talked about before, which is structure, having some visual structure to your page. So again, if this were a blog post, you would have the title be the H1 tag, so it looks like a title, and then you would have the paragraph text in here be paragraph text, so it looks like it is actual paragraph text. So some of this stuff is, it's not, there's nothing sort of earth-shattering about why we use a P tag and so forth. A lot of times it just comes down to default styling, and then when you get into doing CSS, you can target an H1 tag differently than you would target, say, a P tag. You can have certain CSS that's reserved for an heading level 1 versus you can have certain CSS that's for your paragraph tag or for an image tag or for a heading level 3, etc. So again, that's what a lot of this comes down to, is just that default styling and so forth. One thing that I'll sort of throw in here is we also have what's called a break tag. And what a break tag does, if we look at this, you'll notice that between paragraphs we have this space, but when I use a break tag, it puts it right below. So a break tag is essentially a single line break, whereas if a paragraph tag is almost like a double line break. So again, if we sort of look at this and we look at our paragraph tag, and inside of that we have our break tag here, it doesn't have any sort of default styling on it, so it's not going to add that margin before and after, anything like that. All it's going to do is just break this text down to the next line like that. So that's sort of related to a paragraph tag, which is why I wanted to talk about it here. But you can see the difference in the default styling for the different tags. And more often than not, I mean, there's probably some situations where this isn't 100% true, but most of the content that you're going to have on a web page, you're going to want to have it inside of a heading tag or a paragraph tag or a list tag or a span tag, some sort of tag, so that text can be, it has default styling applied to it, and then it can also be targeted via CSS. Next, I want to talk about a series of tags, and these are really sort of text formatting tags. So there's sort of two main ones we're going to go over, and then I'll talk about a third that you might see floating around out there. So the first one is for bolding text. Now, the way that you want to do that, so let's say we want to have this word paragraph be bolded. We would use the tag strong like this. And so this is to indicate some sort of importance, but the way that it ultimately does that inside of the browser is to make it bold like this. So we can see that that is bolded. So that's bolding text. Now, one thing that you might see is something like this, is the B like this. And you'll notice the effect is the same, but sort of in modern web design and web development, we've moved away from using just the B tag like this and using this strong element like that. So if you want to bold something, use the strong tag. Another one that you'll see that you might want to use is it's called the emphasis tag. So it's EM. And EM essentially makes the text italic. So if we refresh this, you'll see we get a italicized text. Now, just like with bolding, we have a sort of an old school counterpart. So something you might see out there is something like this, which is I for italic text. And again, you'll see that the effect is the same, but we have, again, in modern web design development, moved to emphasis or EM like this. It's really just about being semantic instead of talking about what the text effect is. We're talking more giving it sort of actual more meaning than that. Again, we don't have to sort of get into all of that right now, but again, these are things that you're going to see out there. If you want to bold text, if you want to italicize text, you can use strong and M. Another one that you might see out there, let me go ahead and copy this. Another one that you might see out there is this one. It's U. And what this will do, and I actually sort of wonder if it'll still do it because we've moved away from this, but it does. So this is underlined text, and this is something that you will see out there. You may see out there, but really highly recommended not to use. Instead, what you would do is something like this. Now, this seems a little bit cumbersome to do this in line like this, but if you imagine, instead of doing it in a span like this, and you want something to be underlined, for example, inside of Bootstrap, you could add a tag, just a simple tag with a class on it that would add the underline to it. But it's recommended to do it this way at this point, to actually use CSS to do underlining instead of tags like this. So, but again, like I said, you may see that U tag out there floating around. That's what it is. So you sort of know what that is. So those are some of the basic, probably the most common formatting tags that you'll see out there. You do have some other ones. So for example, you have something like this, small. So this will actually create text that is smaller than what sort of the default paragraph text is. So you can see that is a little bit smaller. You will see, you might see something like sub. And so this is going to be a subscript. And of course, it has its counterpart, which is superscript. So do this. And so you can use these out there as well. Again, a lot of this stuff is not going to be super common, but these are some of the different tags that you might find out there. So again, those are some basic formatting tags that you can use. All right, now let's talk about image tags, and this is where we start to get in a little bit more fun stuff here. So I'm going to actually get rid of most of this text here, and now we're going to insert an image tag right below this heading tag. So as I've sort of described before, image tag is IMG, and it doesn't close, and we need to specify a source. Okay, so we need to again specify where the actual image tag that we want to use is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload an image. So I'll go over here to Workspace. We'll sort of follow our conventions. We'll create a new folder called images like this. And then I will take this image that I have on my computer, and I will just put it over here in this images tag. And let me just make this a little bit easier for us to work with. So we'll just do myimage.png like this. And so in order to reference this, now we talked about relative URLs versus absolute URLs. So if we want to reference this, we can do images/myimage.png like this. Okay. And you see that image is dropped into our our page here. Now the problem with this is sort of works because we're in index.html, and so the way the browsers are essentially looking at this is it's saying, okay, you're in index.html and you're looking for my images / my image, so I'm just going to see if there's an images folder on the same level as index.html. Oh, there is. And does that folder contain my image? So it does. Now, you know, if we were to sort of change this up somehow, if index.html was to be further down somewhere in the file structure, then this wouldn't work necessarily this exact way. So one thing that you might want to do is you might want to use an actual absolute URL like this. So we would actually copy the URL of our website and we would drop it in here like this. And let me put a slash there. So in my case, because I'm on a dev server, I have this crazy long URL, but it'd be your URL and then it would be the path to your image like this. And if we refresh that, you'll notice the image still shows up. So a relative URL only works if your site is structured in a particular way where they can work. Absolute URLs will sort of always work. We can put this image wherever and then we can just specify the absolute URL to it and it'll always find it as long as where we say it is, it's actually where we say it is. So the recommended thing to do here is to use absolute URLs like this to make sure that you specify it explicitly so that you don't have anything that crops up that you're not expecting. Okay, so again, we're just giving it the URL where that image is uploaded, and this can be on-site or off-site. Okay, so you could have a CDN where you store your images, or you could store them on Amazon S3 and reference them from there. You know, you could technically reference a URL from somebody else's website, although that's called hot linking, and that's sort of a big no-no, and a lot of sites protect against that. They don't let you do that because they don't want you loading images from their website, and that actually uses up their resources. So that's a whole nother thing, but for our purposes, using the explicit absolute URL is the way to go. And then the last thing here is you always want to include an alt tag like this, and what the alt tag does is if for some reason the image can't be displayed, then this text will be displayed instead. So we'll say something like example source code. And different browsers handle it different ways. This is actually sort of an internal browser for this IDE, so I actually have no idea how it handles it. So we'll see here. But here you go. You see you have the broken image and it says example source code so that it can still be seen. Also screen readers and so forth will use this. So for accessibility for people who need that sort of thing, you always want to include that alt tag and make that alt tag descriptive so that, you know, if someone is reading this with a screen reader, you know, because they're not able to see it themselves, then when the screen reader reads this alt tag, it actually is descriptive about what that particular picture is and so forth, and it actually is useful to them. So that is your image tag. Again, you know, as you'll notice here, let me go ahead and close this up. I don't have the slash at the end of it. I don't have a closing image. I don't have something like this. That is an improper syntax. You don't need to do that. You should not do that. I don't have the HTML or XHTML sort of slash like this. It is just the opening tag. It's called a void tag. We have the source, which is the specific URL that we want to load. We have an attribute called alt for displaying it if we can't load it, or for screen readers and so forth. And of course you can add other attributes in here as well, like style. We could style this with CSS and so forth. But that is the image tag and how it works. Next, let's talk about hyperlinks. So hyperlinks let you link to other web pages on another site or within your own site and so forth. And oftentimes you're going to link them to actual text. So we'll go inside our paragraph tag here. Let me pull this back up real quick because we're going to need to take a look at this, but we'll do courses/HTML. Okay, so let's say we have, this is a paragraph, and then we'll say this is a hyperlink. Now, the hyperlink is denoted with the A tag. Now, that may seem a little bit confusing, but this is technically called an anchor. And we'll talk about anchors sort of towards the end of this. Let me scoot this over just a little. But it's technically called an anchor tag. So that's why it's an A. So with the anchor tag, the attribute that we pretty much have to specify, except in certain situations, is an href, which is hyperlink reference. So this is the URL that we want to link to. So here we'll just do www.google.com. Okay, so we've wrapped the word hyperlink in this anchor tag. We've specified the href, which is google.com. And this, again, needs to be sort of the full URL here for this to work. And if we refresh this, you'll see now, again, this has the default styling. It's blue, it's underlined. If we click that, then this may not go just because of the way this works. Let me open this in a new tab. Okay, and so it goes to Google here. Okay, so that's what a hyperlink does. It's really pretty straightforward. The attribute you need to go along with it is that href, and you can link to anywhere, basically any URL you want with a link tag. Now, I talked about these as anchor tag. Another thing that you can do, let me go ahead and see if there's a way that I can easily show you this. So let me go like this, and actually let's go get some lorem ipsum. So we'll do lorem ipsum just to give us a little bit of space on our page here. So we'll do 5 paragraphs, and we'll generate that, and then let's go ahead and copy this, and then we will come back over here. I'm going to close this up for just a sec so we can see what's going on here, and we'll get rid of all of this, and we'll start dropping this in, and I'm going to sort of put these all in anchor tags here. All right, and last one is up here. Okay, so we've got essentially 5 paragraphs. We've taken this lorem ipsum and we've wrapped it in these paragraph tags, and that will give us some space that we can then look at and on our page and show you how anchor tags can work. All right, so we cleaned up our code here, and now if we go back and we preview, and we'll go to courses/HTML. So you can see now we have this image, and we've got sort of 5 well-defined paragraph tags here. And looks like we don't have enough to create a scroll bar yet. So let me just copy all of this real quick, and we'll put 5 more in there. So that should give us something that we can work with here. All right, so now we've got 10 of these. You can see now we can actually scroll here. So let's go ahead and let's create a new anchor tag here, and we're going to do href, but now we're going to do just call it last, something like this, and we'll say link to last. And then down here in this paragraph tag, we're going to create an anchor, and we're going to say a name equals last, like this, and we're going to just leave it blank like that, and we can actually bring this back up here. All right, so if we refresh this, you can see we have this link to last. We click that, you'll notice I scrolled down here automatically when I click that. So I go like that. That is actually an anchor tag and what it does in this sense. So we've specified the name of the anchor here, and we've put it as the last paragraph here, and then we have linked to that using the href and pound last. Okay, so that's another thing that you can do with anchor tags, is actually create anchors within your pages. So you can create a sort of internal navigation within your pages. This also I'm actually not sure if it'll work on a paragraph tag or not. So we'll just try this. You can do this with, you don't necessarily need to have this anchor tag here. You can also do it with, if you specify an ID of an element. So let me refresh this real quick. See if this works on a paragraph tag. Yeah, so I've specified an ID of last like this, and I'm linking to that pound sign and then last here, so it'll link to that ID as well. So you can add this ID attribute to any element, and then you can link to that using your anchor tag as well. So I know that's not the sort of the normal stuff you think of when you think of hyperlinks and so forth, but we're talking about the anchor tag, and this is one of the things that you can do with the anchor tag as well. Now let's get our feet wet with a little code, and let's actually build a page and sort of use everything or most of the stuff that we've talked about up to this point. So I'm just going to build this web page. You can follow along with me as we go through this. So first thing we need to start off with is our Doctype. And so we'll do our Doctype declaration, and we'll do HTML like this. And then we'll do our opening HTML tag, and then we'll do our head, and then we will do our body. Okay, so again, this is the basic structure of basically every web page that you're going to create. Create a title tag, and we'll say my first web page like this. And then we'll do our meta tag. So we're going to do meta charset equals UTF-8 like this. And then we need to do, we need to account for our responsiveness. So we're going to do meta name equals viewport. And then we're going to do content. We're going to do equals, and width equals device width like this. And then comma, and then initial scale equals 0 like that, and that's all inside of that same meta tag. All right, we'll close up the meta tag like that. We're not going to have any links inside of this. We don't have any style sheet or any of that stuff that we're going to deal with. So we'll sort of leave the head like that, and then we're going to come into our body. And we are going to do our H1 tag. So we're going to do my, we're going to do H1, and we're going to do my first web page. All right. And under that, we can put this paragraph tag, and it says, I am learning HTML and I am excited. All right. So that gives us our sort of our basic structure. We've got our title, we've got our heading, we've got our first paragraph tag. Then we can come down here, and actually, why don't we, in between here, we'll put an image tag, source equals, and I'm going to just copy my URL here. You'll of course want to copy or use whatever yours is. So we'll copy in our URL, and then we'll do slash and images, and it was myimage.png, I believe. And then we'll do alt text equals my first web page like that, and close our image tag. Okay, and we save that, and now we've got our image showing up there. And then let's do, say, an H3 tag that says, what have I learned so far? All right, and so we'll say, we'll do a paragraph tag, and we'll do I've learned, we'll do strong how to bold text, and we will do and then we'll do EM, how to emphasize text like this. So that's bold and emphasis. And let's come over here, and we'll create a new heading here, and we'll do another H3, And we'll just say, what about hyperlinks? Like this. And then in our paragraph tag, we will say, yep, learned that to for or see example. And we'll say anchor href equals, and we'll say http www.google.com, and we'll close our anchor tag like this and say google.com. Okay, and so we have our closing anchor, we have our closing paragraph. We've got a couple H3s in there as well. So if we refresh this, we have my first web page, we have an image. I'm learning HTML, I'm excited. What have I learned so far? I've learned how to bold text and how to emphasize text. What about hyperlinks? Yep, learned that too. See example. If we click this, open it in a new tab, we get google.com here. Okay, so I mean that's a pretty straightforward deal in terms of building a web page. But these are the building blocks of HTML. These are the things that you're going to do over and over and over again. So it's stuff you got to learn. And this is your first web page. So if you've never built a web page before, I hope you're excited about this, because I mean, heck, this took me, when I was learning way back in the day, this took me a long time to learn how to do properly. And you've learned all of that now up to this point in whatever amount of time it's taking you to go through this. So I hope you're excited about this. This is, of course, just a foundation. We're going to continue to build on this throughout the course, but this is your first real web page structured properly with some text and some images and links and so forth in it. So again, I hope you're excited about this, and we'll keep moving forward from here. All right, now let's talk about lists. And there's a couple different kinds of lists that you can make. You can create unordered lists, you can create ordered lists, and you can create description lists or definition lists. So let's go ahead and run through these. So an unordered list starts off with a tag like this, UL. UL for unordered list. You'll see my editor here automatically closes it like that. So it's just like any sort of regular tag where you would have an opening and a closing tags like this. And then inside of this, we have to create our list items. So the UL creates the list as a whole, and then each LI, like this, creates a list item. And this is going to be for both ordered and unordered lists. This is going to be how it works. So inside of this, then you can just put whatever you want. So you could put, let's just do number 1, and then we can create another one, and we can do number 2, and we'll finish up with a third one, number 3. And we'll refresh over here, and that, as you can see, creates our little unordered list. Now what makes it unordered is that we have dots over here, not numbers. Okay, so that's simple unordered list. Now if we want to do an ordered list, it is probably what you would guess. Instead of UL for unordered list, it's OL for ordered list. And again, we just can put in, let's just do option 1. We can put in our LI statements, or LI tags here. Option 2 and option 3. And if we take a look at that, then you will see that we have those ordered. So they are numbered. So again, that's the difference between unordered and ordered lists. So pretty straightforward there. You create them similarly. Description lists are a little bit different. This is something that was introduced in HTML5. And these allow you to create lists that have a little bit more detail with them. So in order to start one of these, the parent tag is DL like this. So for description list, and again, it's opening and closing tag. But now inside of here, instead of having just list items, we can actually have 2 different items. So the first one is a DT. This is for the title. So we can do title here, and then we can do DD, and this is for the description. So we can do description goes here. And actually, let's just go ahead and make one more like this. So we can do title 2 goes here, and description 2 goes here. All right, so if we take a look at this, then what we get is something where we have title and then we have a description underneath of that. So it allows us to create a list with a few more options instead of just being able to put in a one chunk of text here like you can in an ordered or unordered list. It allows us to create a title and a description but still create a list. And that can be helpful this is particularly helpful for when you start working with JavaScript or jQuery and creating an accordion. That's sort of some of the first places that I ever saw it done. But there's other uses as well where this can come in handy. So again, that's just another type of list that you can create. Another thing that you may want to do with lists is you may want to nest lists. So let's do our UL. Let's do an LI like this, and let's do parent. And then instead of closing this tag like happened here, actually we can keep it closed, but we're going to move it down here a little bit. And then under this parent, we're going to create a new unordered list, and we'll call this child, and then we'll call this grandkids, or children, I guess we can do here. Okay, so if you look what we have here, actually, that doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to put this down here. Closing UL. All right. So what we have here is we have an unordered list. We have inside of that, we have one list item right here. And then inside of that list item, we have another unordered list. And you can do this. This is valid sort of HTML. And if we take a look at that, that is how you get this sort of this extra indentation here with your list. So if you want to do, a lot of times this is used in menus where you have a menu item, and then underneath that menu item you have some menu items, you can have another sub menu and so forth, and keep sort of going with that. That is how you do this. You nest an unordered list inside of another list item, and it will indent it for you. Of course, you need to use some CSS to style this for menus purposes, but this gives you the basic HTML in order to do that. The last thing that we'll then look at here is when you're dealing with ordered lists, one thing that you may want to do is you may want to change the numbering. So the way that we can do that is with an attribute called start. So let's say we set this to 33. I'll pick a very arbitrary number like this. And then inside of this, we're going to do option 1, and we'll go li option 2. Okay, and we refresh that, and now you can see the numbering starts at 33 instead of 1. So that's another thing that you may want to do with your lists. Now let's talk about tables. Tables are a really great way of displaying lots of data and having it appear in an organized manner. A lot of applications, say for example WordPress, they will take their data objects, and when they want to list those out, they'll put them inside of tables. So the posts, the pages, the users, all that sort of thing in an application like WordPress will use a table to display it. And again, it's just because it's a good way of displaying data, lots of data, in a way that is organized and easy to go through. So in order to create a table, we start off with, surprise, surprise, a tag called table. And then inside of that, we're going to have a couple different tags. So the first one is for each row, you are going to have a TR tag for table row. Okay, so again, each row that you want to create, you'll have one of those. We'll go ahead and drop in just 3 of these like this. And then inside of your rows, then you can have columns. And so there's 2 types of columns you can create. You can create a header column or just sort of a regular data column. And so these have the header columns have the tag TH, and this will just be styled a little bit differently. So we'll just do name, and we'll do age, and we will do email. Okay, so that's going to be our header row. If we refresh this real quick and just look at it, you can see we have name, age, and email, and you'll notice that these are bolded. Now if we come down here to one of these rows, we're going to put in our actual data. And so for a regular cell, you're going to use TD like this. And again, that'll be styled a little bit differently. So we'll just do John Morris. We'll do wishful thinking 29. If you believe that, I've got some property for sale for you. And then we'll do just email@email.com. And then we'll come down here to our last row and do sort of the same thing. So we'll just do John Doe. And we'll do age 57. And for the email, we will do john@doe.com. And if we refresh that, then you can see we have our data displayed here. We have our rows this way. We have our columns up and down. Everything's organized, nice and easy to read. I'll do this up here just to give us a little bit more definition. We're, of course, not going to get into CSS here, but I'll do TH and TD, and I'll just do min width 100 pixels like this. So this is going to give our cells a little bit of width so that the data is not so crunched up there. But again, that's a standard table. You're going to have the rows. Oftentimes you'll have a header row like this. Then you're going to have your data inside of it, and that will just sort of go on forever. Now, a couple things that you can do. If we come down here, we have what's called call span and row span. So this allows you to designate that a particular row. Well, when we're dealing with columns, a particular column spans more than one column. So if we come to this header, this makes sense when we're here, and we do this, and we do call span equals 2. What we're saying is that this column now is going to span 2 columns. So you'll notice here now we only have 2 of these header columns, but one that has a call span of 2, and then down here we have 3. So the way this should work is we have 1 column, and then here we have 2 columns. We still have a total of 3, which should match up with our data down below here. And so what you can see here is now we have name and age spans these 2 columns right here. So it's sort of centered on these 2 right here. So that is how you can do a column span like that. And you can use that in a multitude of ways to display different data. You can do the same thing with rows. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's get rid of this call span equals 2. And let's do name and age like this. And we'll get rid of the email block here. And now what we'll do is on this sort of second row here, and this can be, the way this works can be a little bit different. Sometimes you would do this like in a situation where you're displaying data in this way, because with tables you can display data in a multitude of different ways. So here we might do a name and then actually display the name in here like this. And then you might do down here, let's say age 29, and we'll do email and we'll do email@email.com. Okay, so there's different ways that you can display the data like this. If we look at this one, then you'll see it's just displayed a little bit differently. And so what we'll come down here and do then with this is, and actually these should be TH, oops, like this. All right. So now you can see it's name, age, email, and then you have name, age, email. So it's displayed a little bit differently. Okay, so when we're talking about something like that, then we can do a row span. So on this second one here, we can do row span equals 2, like this. Okay, we'll keep our TD just like this, but now we'll come down here and we'll get rid of this TH because we did the row span on this TH. Now that's going to essentially eat up the third one from this row. And so now you can see, just like before, how age is centered across these two cells right here. Now with our row, we have name that's right next to John Morris, but age is centered sort of between 29 and email.com. Now again, this isn't necessarily how you would use this and display this data and so forth, but you can see here that this is being centered on these two rows. So again, this one works sort of horizontally for column span. It allows you to span columns. This one works sort of vertically, which allows you to span across different rows. So you can use those sort of as you see fit in the different situations that you might encounter. But that's sort of the ins and outs of tables, at least when it comes to HTML. With tables, there's definitely a lot of CSS that you would probably get into to want to style these and so forth. But like I said, this is the HTML parts of it that you would really want to know when working with tables. Next, let's talk about forms. Now, there's a lot that can go into forms and a lot you can do with forms. So I'm going to try and give you the most common things that you'll want to know to get started working with forms. So the first thing is, just in order to create a form, you're going to use the form tag like this. It is an opening and closing. And then inside of this, you are going to have a number of different elements that you can put inside of this that will actually make up your form. Now, when it comes to the actual tag itself, there are a number of important attributes. Probably the two most important ones are first going to be what's called the method. And you can pass in either get or post. Now, these are related to processing by server-side script, for example, PHP. And so that's sort of beyond what we want to talk about here. But the idea of the method is that you can specify which method you want this form to be handled by. So get, what that will do is the data that's submitted by the form, it will actually turn all of that data into query variables, and it will pass that data in the URL of the browser. And so that affects when you then go to process this with, say, PHP, you have to grab the data from the URL in that instance if you use get. Now, if you use post, it's actually, the data is not posted in the URL, it's sort of posted behind the scenes, and then in your PHP script, you have to know to grab it in that sense. So the method will affect, again, how you're going to process this. I would say a general rule of thumb, most often what you see is that when it's passed via get, it's something like a search form where you want to be able, when you create search results from a search form, for example, let's say Google, oftentimes you want to be able to link to those results. Well, you can't do that if you use the post method. You can only do that if you use the get method. So a lot of times it's if you want to be able to link to or somehow come back and be able to access and be able to go directly to a particular submission from a form, you would use get. Since that is passed in the URL, you could then just copy that URL and go directly to that URL, and you would get the same result as if you had submitted the form. So that's generally the instance where you'd use get. Post method is pretty much for everything else. So most of the time you're going to use the post method. General rule of thumb is default to the post method unless you come across some compelling reason why you would want to use get. All right, the other thing then is the action. So the action is going to be the script that is going to process this form. So wherever that is, that can be a relative URL like this. It can be an absolute URL. It can actually be blank, and then this form will submit right back to this very same page. So depends how your overall application is going to be built, but those are the different actions that you can specify in there. All right, so that's sort of the form tag itself. Then inside of the form tag, you have a number of different elements that you can put in there. So the first one is sort of the most common one. it is the input tag like this. And the way that this structure works is you start off with the input, so that's the type of tag, and then you have some attributes that you need to specify for this to work. So first is the type, okay? And we'll get into in just a second the different input types that we can work with, but we'll just start off with sort of the generic one, which is text, and then you need to give it a name. So for example, email address, like this. Okay, so, and this is a tag. This is essentially a void tag. Okay, so you're not going to have a closing tag for this. It's all just the opening tag. Okay, so that will actually create if we look at this, that will create an input tag like this. Now, of course, you may want to give that a label, is another thing that we can include in here, and we could say email like this. And then we will have a label and an input like you might see from a lot of different forms. And then, of course, you can style that how you want. So that's the input tag. The next one is the select tag. I'm going to go ahead and actually, let's just go ahead and leave that. Next one is the select tag. So this is for a drop-down box. So it's select. And then you need to give it a name. So name, and let's just do options. And this is an opening and closing tag because inside of it, now you have to put your options. So you're going to do options or option, and then you're going to give it a value. And we'll talk about this in a sec. So let's just give this a value of 1, and we'll say option 1. And then you might come down here and do option value equals 2. And option 2. Okay, so if we refresh this and look at this, you can see we get a drop down box that says option 1, option 2. Okay, so the way that this works is this option 1 and option 2 between the tags is what's going to display visually here. But the value is what's going to be submitted behind the scenes. Remember our method here, we're saying it's going to be submitted to a processing script. What gets submitted is the value when it comes to these select boxes here. So this allows you to create a human readable drop option in the drop down box, but this allows you to create something that's a little bit more machine friendly. So you can separate those two things. That'll get submitted behind the scenes, and then you'll be able to handle it accordingly based off of whatever you want to do in terms of your processing. All right, so that's the select box. Next one is a text area. So we can do text area like this. And then actually, again, we need to give this a name. So text area name equals, we'll just do message like this. Now here you can specify rows and columns to specify a size. So you can do something like this. Rows, let's just say 10. And we will do calls equals 20, something like that. Okay, so that allows you to sort of build in some sizing to it. And then we close that. And then most of the time, you're going to leave this empty like this. You can put in a default value like this. And what will happen, let's just go ahead and look at this. You see we have, now this is sized, and we have default value in here. But actually, if someone wanted to enter data, they would have to get rid of that default value. So usually what we want to do is we want to do placeholders. And we'll talk about placeholders in just a second. But normally with this, you'll want to keep that sort of empty like that. All right. So let's drop down here. So we've got text area. And again, there's a number of different ones that we can sort of do here in terms of all of the different elements that we could. There's things like field sets, and I showed you labels. You can do legends and data lists and so forth. I guess one other probably common one would be a button like this. You can do buttons inside of here, and we would do type equals button. You can do submit There's a number of different things that you can do with buttons, but if you want to have some sort of button inside of here, and you could say this is a button like that. Okay, and so this is a button here, and again, depending on how you set it up, you can use buttons to submit forms if you want. Oftentimes you'll use an input, but again, there's a number of them inside of here. Data lists, there's an output, there's option group, and so forth. Those are very, very much less common. These are sort of the standard things that you're going to be used inside of a form. And then the thing where you really get into the different sort of fields that you can create is where you start talking about input types. So we talked about input. We have input, select, text area, button here, but you can do a whole bunch of different input types. Okay, so we've got text here. Another one that you can do is that you probably will come across is password. So let's do password like this. Let's just say password. Let me real quick just wrap some of this inside a paragraph tag so it's a little easier for us to sort of look at. And then we'll come down here. We'll do a paragraph tag like this. And that'll give us a little bit of separation. Then we'll just move this stuff down here. Okay, so with a password field, which is the second one right here, when you type into it, you notice it gives you just the dots. So that's what a password field is used for. That can be very, very useful. Obviously another really common one, or the one that you'll use in pretty much every form, is, as I mentioned, the submit button. So we'll do a paragraph tag, and then we'll do input type equals submit like this, and you can give this a name. Now the thing about giving this a name is it will allow you to target it a specific, you can target this in your processing script. A lot of times that's not necessary, so you don't have to do it, but you can give it a name like name equals submit, and you may see that out there when you're looking at HTML code. We'll leave that off just for brevity's sake, but then you can do value equals, and this is going to be what shows up in the actual button when this creates the submit button. So if we refresh that, you can see it says click me here. If we click it, you notice it sort of refreshed there a little bit. That's because that form was submitted. Okay, so that is how you ultimately submit the form. So that's the submit button. You have things like a reset button that you can use. So let's go ahead and do that. Input type equals reset, and I can actually just do this like this. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And you see we have the reset button here. So, and you see it clears the form when you do that. So that's a reset button that you can create. Two of the more common ones are going to be checkboxes and radio buttons. So let's first talk about the radio button. So we'll create a new paragraph. We'll do input type equals, and then we will do radio like this. Now this can be a little bit tricky. So we're going to do the name of this, and we'll just call it R radio like this, and then you're going to give it a value. Okay, and the value, let's just say option 1. Okay, and we close that up. Now this is just going to create a single radio button. Now if you're familiar with radio buttons, oftentimes let's do one like this, and then we will do on the outside of the tag, we'll do option 1. You're choosing among different options oftentimes. Okay, so in order to do that, let's create a break here. What you'll do is you will take this same tag and we'll copy this whole thing over here. You'll take this same tag and you'll create multiple options with the same name. Okay, so let's drop this down here, and the name is going to remain the same, but the value is what will change. So we'll do 2, and we'll do 2, and then one more. We'll do 3, and then we're changing our display text as well. Okay, so what we end up with is a radio button where you can only select one of these options like this. And what happens is whatever one you select, that is the value that's going to, when you hit submit, that is the value that is going to be sent behind the scenes. So for example, up here, how we have this input, text, and email, and whatever we type in here, that is the value that's going to get sent. Here, it's whichever option we select is the value that's going to be sent. Okay, so that's how you create a radio button that allows people to select among one option. Now, checkboxes are sort of similar, except that they can choose multiple. Okay, so let's do paragraph tag. Let's do input type equals checkbox. And then here, we're going to do name equals, and we'll do option 1. We'll do value equals, we'll do like this. We'll do, let's say, vehicle. And we'll do value equals bike. And then outside of that, we'll say I have a bike, and break tag, and then input type equals checkbox. We'll do name equals vehicle, and we'll do value equals car. I have a car. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can do this. You could actually do this like, say, vehicle 2. And so you would have 2 different options here. And it says, I have a car, I have a bike. When this is submitted, the name would be vehicle, and then vehicle 2, and the value would be bike, and the value would be car. So all of that data would be submitted behind the scenes. Another way that you can do this is you can do vehicle, and then you can put these brackets and do bike, and then you can do vehicle and car like this. And you could change these to 1 and 1. So what happens when you do that is, because these have the same beginning name like this, and again, if you're not familiar with say PHP, this may not be as familiar, but what will happen is these will actually be submitted in the same element under in a PHP array. They'll be submitted in the same element called vehicle, and then they'll have nested in that, so sort of like an unordered list where we have items nested under that, it'll say bike and car, or whichever ones they check here. If they just check bike, it'll just have bike. If you just check car, it'll just have car. If you check both, it'll have both. And it'll have the value set to 1 for each of those. And so what it allows you to do in your processing script is just target the one element vehicle, and then look inside of that to see how many of the different options that you had listed here available. So again, there's 2 different ways that you can do that. The biggest difference between checkboxes and radio boxes is radio boxes are meant to select one of a group of options, whereas checkboxes you can select multiple and so forth. So those are sort of the main types that you'll deal with. You do have sort of the HTML types that were added. So things like, if we come here, let's go under checkbox here. We can do input type equals color, name equals color, like this. We'll just do color. So you can do things like that, and what that'll do is you'll notice that now we have a color picker here That brings up a color picker, so that's sort of built in. You have email. So if we come up here, this email one, if we change this to email instead of text, and we refresh that, and I try to submit this with something that's not an email, I'll get please include this at in the email address. Okay, so it'll actually do a little bit of validation for us. So color, you have date time pickers, you have emails, you have email, you have month, you can do a number, you can do a range, you can do search, telephone numbers, time, you have URLs. All those are things you can specify as a type, and they all have some sort of relevant functionality, like the email checks to see if it's a valid email address. The color picker the color includes a color picker. Whatever is relevant to that type, it will sort of include that with it. So those are a bunch of different types that you can deal with. All right, so the last thing then I want to deal with here is attributes. So, and there's, again, a ton of attributes that we could talk about, but there's two sort of ones that I want to focus on. So let's change this back to text from email. And then let's add at the end of this something called required, right? So what that will do is it will make this required. So if I try to submit this without entering any in, you'll see it says, please fill out this field. So that's a really nice way to make something required that's sort of built right in. Another thing that you can do, there's a couple different ways you can use this. You can use one called read only. And so if we look at that, it will make this so it's read only. I can't actually click in it. You'll notice that. You can also do disabled like this. So we refresh that, and now you'll see it's disabled. I can't actually, it's like grayed out. I can't click in there again either. There's things like size. You can specify the max length. So for example, we could do max length equals 1, and we'll refresh this. And so in this email block, you'll see if I'm trying to hit more of these, I can only type in 1 character. So you have that available as well. There's things like autocomplete and autofocus, and again, lists and min and max. There's multiple. For down here under select, you could do something like multiple. Let's refresh that. So now this box right here, you can see it. If I hit, I believe it's control, I can select multiple options here, so you can do that as well. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do with different forms and the attributes and so forth. These are some of the most common. One of the ones that was added in HTML5 that is super common that you'll want to know is placeholder. So let's just change this to placeholder. And what a placeholder will do is, let's just say enter email. Okay, so if we refresh this, this will actually enter that text in there. But when I click in here, I don't have to get rid of it. I can just start typing. So that's what a placeholder does. That's pretty common. You'll pretty much want to include those. The support for that is now pretty good. And you'll pretty much want to include those with all of your input forms where someone is going to be typing text. So your emails, your generic text boxes, your text areas, and so forth. Anywhere where that will give them a little bit better hint of what to type. A lot of times, forms will actually even just get rid of the label and just include the placeholder there as well. So, again, there's a ton of these out there. So going through all these, we could spend hours doing this, but I want to give you the basic idea, show you some of the more common ones. And then, once you sort of understand how inputs work and how you can change the type and so forth, then it becomes a little bit straightforward to go from there. Now let's talk about special characters inside of HTML. And I like to break these down mentally into 2 different categories. And before I tell you this, I'm sort of taking a liberty here. If you look at some of the technical documentation and stuff out there, this isn't exactly 100% how they would delineate this. But for me, it just makes it a little bit easier way of thinking about it. So I distinguish between entities and symbols. So let's talk about entities first. So an example of an entity would be something that you've already seen before, a less than sign like this. And if I refresh this page and I display this, you'll see when I write out a less than sign like this, I get a less than sign. If I do, if I add to that a greater than sign like this, and we refresh that, then we get the less than and then the greater than. The thing about this is this may not seem like it's that important, but there's a couple things. One, when you're doing it this way, for example, you may write something in here. Let's say you want to tell someone, you might want to write a post where you're doing a coding tutorial and you want to tell someone to use the HTML tag, right? So you're not actually trying to write the HTML tag as the HTML tag. You're trying to tell them to use this. Well, you know, you might have to do something like this where you put spaces in there so that this will actually show up. You'll notice when I had them together, it disappeared. That's because the browser thought that this was the actual tag. So that can start to get a little tricky. So we have this thing that we call entities. So instead of actually typing a less than or greater than sign, we can type code that looks like this: an and sign, LT, and then a colon or semicolon. And then we can do HTML, and we can do end, and then we can do GT, and we like this. So what this does, these are called HTML entities. And if we refresh this, now you'll see that the tag appears. I don't have to add any spaces to it and so forth. So what the browser does is actually takes these and says, okay, they're trying to display this character. They're not trying to write a tag in their code. So it allows you to sort of make that delineation explicitly. And so there are all sorts of these HTML entities. There's huge lists you can find out there. If you just do HTML entities, you'll find these massive lists that are out there. But another example would be a great and sign. So it's called an ampersand. So if you type something like that, then you'll get an ampersand. You know, one that you might see quite a bit is you'll see this and NBSP like this, which stands for non-breaking space. This will actually just create, if we come down here and we refresh that, you see we get a little space in here. Okay, so it just creates a little bit of space. So there's double quotation marks, single quotation marks, etc. So all of these entities like this, where it is characters that are sort of kind of the part of the normal sort of the normal day-to-day of coding, like a less than and greater than signs, and ampersand, double quotes and single quotes. I mentally sort of think of these all as entities. But you also have then these other sort of marks or these other sort of entities that you can use, which I refer more to as symbols. So very good example that you may have seen before is one like this. And if we refresh that, what we get is we get a copyright symbol. Okay, so hopefully that helps make clear the difference between the two. The copyright is an actual copyright symbol that I'm wanting to create, whereas the less than or equal than sign is maybe something that's more relevant or related to coding. That is a character that I'm going to use quite a bit throughout my code. But in this specific case, I want to specify that I just want the character displayed. I don't want it to be processed by the browser as if it were a part of my actual code. Okay, and so then there are all sorts of these symbols that you can do. Another one that you may see out there is and trade like this, or you can do reg like that. You can do stuff like this. So these are probably a little less a little less common, but you can do spades, or you can do something like this, NRAR. That's for a right arrow. So let's just go ahead and take a look at all of these. So now you get a trademark, you get a registered trademark, you get a spade symbol, you get a right arrow. Okay, so again, those are HTML HTML entities. The symbols are things that, again, generally I can't type with my keyboard. Like I don't have a copyright button on my keyboard. I don't have a spades button on my keyboard. But I do have a less than and a greater than sign on my keyboard. I do have a quote, a single quote and a double quote sign on my keyboard. I do have an ampersand on my keyboard. So again, that's the way I like to distinguish them. If it's on my keyboard, I generally think of it as an entity. If it's not, I think of it as a symbol. And the way you write these is the same. It's always you start with an ampersand, the name of the entity, and then a semicolon to close it out. And again, there's just huge lists out there of these that you can look up for whatever you happen to be looking for and want to display. The next tag I want to talk about is the address tag, which maybe a little bit more of an obscure tag, but it can be one that you can add to your documents that can potentially add some usefulness to the pages you create. So the address tag looks like this. Oh, go ahead and click over here. Looks like this, and again, it is an opening and closing tag. And then inside of it, you can put various sorts of information. You can put, links to email addresses, links to URLs. You can put physical addresses, and so forth. So we might write something like this. So written by, and then we would do href equals, and we'll use a mail to tag, or the mail to URL, which will actually, when someone clicks this, it'll pop open their email provider that they use if they've set that, or it'll ask them to set which one they want to use, but we'll just say john@doe.com. So again, when they click this link, it will actually try to open an email and address it to that email address, so they don't have to copy and paste it and stuff. So say this is written by John Doe, and let's use a break tag here. And then we could do something like URL. We do a href equals www.johndoe.com like this, and we could do johndoe.com, and we could do a break tag again. Okay, and then we could do, let's say, let's just do it like this. Address, actually, let's just do 555 East 1st Street, some city, USA, 55512, something like that, right? You could type in an actual physical address here. And if we look at this, then, it'll just sort of print it out. You'll notice it puts it in italics. That's sort of the default styling for this. And you'll notice, so there's a couple different ways to use this. So I have this in the body tag right here. So what I'm doing here is saying that this is the contact information for this particular page. Okay. And so you're sort of signaling to the browser, but also any search engines that might index this page and so forth, that for this particular web page, this is the contact information. Now, we haven't talked about this tag yet, but you can actually create a tag called article like this, and this will specify that you are creating sort of an individual article, and you can put your address tag inside of that, and instead of saying that this is the contact information for the entire document, the entire page, it will say this is the contact information for this individual article within the document. So depending on what you're doing, you can sort of signal that, again, to the browser, search engines, and so forth, and they can use this in sort of different ways. Google's sort of always playing with author information and so forth. So this is a good way to signal to them who's the author of this particular article, or who is the creator of this particular web page, and allowing them to sort of use that how they may want to use that. The one thing about this particular tag is that you don't just add it if you're putting a street address or information like that on a site. You don't just use this for any old sort of postal address or anything like that. So you don't you wouldn't want to use this every time you write out a postal address. You only want to use it when you're specifying this is the contact information for this article or this document. Okay, so if you're just going to write out a regular old postal code that doesn't have anything to do with signaling to the browser and search engines that these are the contacts for this particular page, if you're just writing one out, you wouldn't use the address tag. It's only used to specify this is the contact information for this document. Okay, so I just want to make sure and make that clear. And oftentimes this will be something that would actually go in your footer tag. So you would probably have your body, and then you'd come down here and create a footer tag like this. And then this is one of the things that you would put down in the footer tag. Now let's take a lot of the things that we've learned up to this point, and let's go ahead and build a page with these. So we're going to start off with an H1 tag. We're going to call this my second web page. And we'll do a paragraph tag that says we'll build a form and table and some other stuff. All right, and then let's go ahead and pull this over just a little bit. All right, and then inside of this, let's go ahead and create an H3 tag, and we'll say here's our table. And then let's create a table, and we'll just give this 3 rows. So we'll go like this. Actually, let's do this. So let's go ahead and just create our header row. So let's go TH, and we're going to go name, and then under that TH we will go age, and then under that we will go let's go cat, or we'll do animal. Well, that'll make sense in a second. All right, so then I'm just going to copy this. We know we're going to fill our table with data that mimics this, so we'll just create 2 more options in here, and then we will take all of these. And in my system, I can do Control H, and that'll bring up this find. I can do TH, and I'm going to replace with TD. But I'm going to step through these. So let me go back to that first one, and I'm just going to step through. I'm not going to hit replace all. I'm just going to hit replace one. And actually, I got to go back even further. Or no, that was the right one. Okay, so we can step through these, place all these with regular TDs instead of me typing through that. Okay. So that's done. And then we're going to change this to John Doe, change this to 29. Animal is cat, and then we'll do this Jane Doe, age 30. Animal is dog. Okay, so that'll give us some tabular data. If we refresh all of this, you'll see my second web page. Here's our table. We've got our table filled out with some data in it. And then under that, we're going to add a form. So let's do H3, add some stuff to our table like this. And then we're going to create a form. Now, this isn't a PHP course. We're not actually going to add this data, but this is sort of a similar thing that you might do. And then you would, of course, learn PHP or a server-side scripting language to be able to actually add it. But no, we're not actually going to do that here. So here we would create a form. We'll do method equals post action, and we'll leave blank. So this would submit to this same page. And then inside of this, let's do a paragraph tag, and we're going to do label. And we will do email. And then actually, let's go ahead and drop this down so it's a little bit easier to read here. And we're not messing with CSS, so I'm just going to use a break tag. You could actually, when you learn CSS and are using CSS, you could actually get this to where you don't have to add this break tag. But for now, we'll just go ahead and do this. Actually, let's make this one name is what it was, not email. So we'll do name, and then we'll do input type equals text, and we'll do name equals name, and we'll do placeholder equals enter your name, like that. Okay, so that's for our name, and then let's do our age. So age, we'll do number here. To be honest with you, I've never actually used the number type before, so we'll see how that works, but why not take a risk, right? And we'll change this to age as well. So we got an input text that's name, says enter your name. We have an input that's number, it says age, enter your age, and then we need one for our cat or dog. So we're going to do input type equals checkbox, and we're going to do name equals animal, and then value equals cat. We'll close that, and we'll do cat, and then a break, and we'll do input type equals checkbox, or no, I'm doing checkbox, but we actually want this to be a radio. So we'll do radio, like that. Name equals animal again. Value equals dog. And we'll do dog, like that. And then we need our submit button. So normally these you don't have to wrap in the paragraph tag. We'll do input type equals submit, value equals submit, like that. And then we'll do input type equals reset, like this. Okay. So let's take a look at that and see what we got here. So now we have a form. It says enter your name, enter your age. You can select between dog and cat. If we enter our name, we'll just do John. John Morris. In number. So I can't type. I'm trying to type characters here, I can't do that. But if I come over here to type a number, I can certainly type a number. I can also do this and increment it up and down like that. So we'll do our wishful thinking of 29 again. If I hit reset, it clears it all. If I hit submit, then it'll submit it because I haven't made any of these required. If I wanted to make one of these required, let's just drop it in here under name and refresh that, and then hit submit. It won't let me submit it now. It tells me I need to fill out the field. And so that's our form. And then, we talked about the special characters. So we could do, and copyright 2018 John Morris, like this, to add our copyright in there as well. Maybe wrap that in a paragraph tag like this. So it has a little bit of spacing between the form there. So those are some of the main things that we covered. Of course, we have unordered lists, we have definition lists and so forth that we could add in there. Maybe we'll just drop something in here like this. So let's come up here and let's just do paragraph tag, how to use this form. And then we'll do an ordered list, enter your name. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So we have an ordered list, and then we want to drop that down, and then we'll do a list item, enter your name. Another list item, enter your age. And then li, and get rid of that, and we'll do select your animal, hit submit. All right, so there's a little ordered list for us as well to throw that in there. So how to use this form, enter your name, enter your age. You see it's an ordered list and so forth. So that's a rundown of some of the stuff that we've used in sort of the second section, quote unquote, of this course, to allow you to get an idea of how you might use something like this. This is somewhat again, reasonable in terms of something you might actually do, have a form that submits data to a database, and then using, again, server-side code, you'd pull the information from that database and display it in a table like this. So from the HTML side of things, this is not an uncommon thing. This is something that you might actually do on a fairly regular basis. Now it's time for IDs and classes in HTML and how they tie into CSS and JavaScript. So let's start with classes, and what it looks like is you would just create a HTML tag. These can be added to any HTML tag, and then you use the word class, so it's an attribute like any other, equal signs, and then your quotes, and then you can give it sort of any name that you want. So we'll just give this the name of name, and we'll say John Morris like this. Okay, and with classes now, a class, what it specifies is it essentially gives this HTML element this name, and it can be used by CSS and JavaScript for the different things that those do for styling or for JavaScript functionality and so forth. And we'll talk about how you target those in CSS in just a second. But with classes, the main difference between classes and IDs is with classes, you can have multiple elements that have the same class name. So we can do something like this, and let's just go John Doe and Jane Doe like this. So you can do something like this, and this is perfectly valid to do with classes. However, it would not be something that you could do that would be valid when it comes to IDs if you were to try to do this with an ID. So classes, you can have multiple elements on the same page that have a class. With IDs, you can only have one element on a page that has that ID for it to be valid. Okay, so that's the main difference. Now what we use these for, something like this, if we were to come up here and create a style tag and write some CSS, we could do something like, with classes, the way you target it in CSS is use a dot. With IDs, it's a pound sign like this. And we'll talk about IDs here in a second. But we can do a dot, and then the name of our class, and then it's wrapped inside opening and closing curly brackets. So we can do something like this, background color, and we'll just do E4, E4, E4 like this. That's a hexadecimal color, and the text color to, actually let's do black, and we'll do a padding of 20 pixels. So something like this, and that's going to apply that styling to any element that has that class name. And actually, let's just go ahead and do this. We'll do one that doesn't have that class name like that. Right, so let me open up my preview here. And okay, so, and actually we're using a color that matches the background of this. So let me go ahead and just change this to something a little easier to see. All right, so it gives it that styling. You can see we have the padding around it, and you can see that this something else doesn't have it applied. Okay, so that's what this allows us to do. You can also target it with JavaScript. That's sort of beyond the scope here, but it's sort of the same idea as now that it has a class name, you can target it with JavaScript. You can also, not only can different elements have the same class name, one element can have multiple class names. So it could be, family. It could be Morris, or let's do dash Morris, and then John, or however you wanted to do that. But it could have multiple class names like this, And you can come up here and you could do, let's say, .John, and you could do background color, and we could do 555. Let's just say, let me do hexadecimal. 555 like this. And now you see that one changes here. Okay, so again, an element can have multiple class names, and multiple elements can have the same class name. Now with ID, it's a little, and this could very easily, just to be clear here, this could very easily be a completely different element. It does not have to be the same element, even though they have the same class name. And then you can see here we've got now an H2 tag here, and it still has the styling that we created in our CSS up here. Okay, now with IDs, it's a similar sort of thing. Except we use the word ID equals, and we can give this something else. We can give the name something else, and let's go ahead and give this a class equals of name, like that. So we're applying that same styling to it, but now let's go ahead and come down here and let's do in CSS for IDs, we use a pound sign, and we target it like this. Again, opening, closing curly brackets, and now we can do color like this, and it will override what we've specified in the class. Now, the way this works is CSS stands for, it's really hard to talk about IDs and classes without talking about CSS. So I'm doing my best to not get too far into CSS here, but to really understand how these work, we have to talk about it a little bit. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet, meaning that the styles sort of cascade downward. So if I were to take this, now remember we have the background color, this top one, set to gray. If I were to take this and I were to move this up here, you will see that even though I'm specifying that John should have a background color, it's now still red. The reason is because this element up here has two classes. They're both styling the background color, and so the way that CSS figures out which one it should use is it cascades down. So it first starts with this one, but then this one gets overridden by this one down here. Okay, so that's sort of how CSS works. However, when you have an ID like this, if we take this up here, put it above name, you see we still get the styling. So IDs will override classes no matter where they are in the style sheet, if all things being equal. So that's something to keep in mind, because an ID is something, it's a more specific way to target an element than a class. So again, that's something to keep in mind when you're writing your HTML here. So that's IDs and classes. Sort of went through the difference and all that sort of thing. And so now you can use those, and as you get into CSS, those will become a lot more useful. You get into JavaScript, those will become a lot more useful for you. Now let's talk about span and div. And you might be a little wondering, if you sort of studied HTML at all, why I would be grouping these two things together. And so I want to talk about these two just a little bit before we dive into actual writing of the code. But one of the things that you may have heard quite a bit thrown around when you're talking about HTML is this idea of semantic markup. And sort of what that means is that HTML is really all about giving meaning to content. So when you wrap something in a P tag, what you're saying is that that is a paragraph of text. Or when you wrap something in an H1 or H2 tag, you're saying that that is a heading. That gives that content, that tag just being applied to that content, gives it some sort of meaning. And span and div tags are sort of different in that they don't actually apply any meaning at all. And so when you wrap something in a div or a span, they're really just meant to sort of group chunks of code together, chunks of content together, and oftentimes they're used in conjunction with classes and IDs primarily for styling or maybe just for organization, but they're different than a lot of tags out there because they don't really have any inherent meaning to them. So the way you write them is what you would probably imagine. Just a div tag looks just like this. You can nest div tags inside of themselves like this, and then you can do, say, h1, and you can do stuff here, and then you can target these using CSS. So style, and we can do div background color like this, right? And so you can target them like sort of like that. You give these classes and IDs if you wanted to, but again, they really don't have any sort of inherent meaning. They're just really meant to sort of group different sort of pieces of text together. Now, the difference between a span tag and a div tag is that a span tag is meant to be used in line with your text, and it's usually used for really small chunks of text, and so it's an inline element, whereas a div is meant to group larger things together sort of outside of the text, and it is a block level element. So for a span tag, you might do something like this. Span class equals, let's do highlight, and we'll close our tag here. Right, so you notice the span is used in line with the text, whereas the div is used on sort of on the outside, wrapping the text. And then we could come up here and we could do highlight, and we could do color red like this. And so you see that the span element has that style applied to it. Okay, and so again, these are just ways that you can wrap text, wrap different parts of what you're building into these different organizations or grouping or whatever. And the reality is these really shouldn't, with what came out with HTML5, these were used a lot more before HTML5, but now they are not used near as much, or shouldn't be used near as much, because you are going to have actual semantic sort of organizational parts that are available, or tags that are available inside of HTML5. So a header and a footer, a nav, sections, articles, asides, all of these elements that we're going to talk about that came along with HTML5, these allow you to do the same thing that divs did, but do it in a semantic way. And then when it comes to the span and the inline sort of text like that, you really, you should be using the proper sort of markup here. So if we wanted to highlight something like this, then we might use something like emphasis, do EM, and then we can style, or we can do like font style, italic like this. And we can still target that element even though it's an EM element like this. It's an emphasis element. You really should be using that, or something like strong like this is what you should be using instead of span. Now again, if you're in a situation where those don't make sense, or you can't use those for some reason, then span is always there, but it should be used as sort of the last resort. Div and span should be used as last resort, and if you have something that is more semantic to use, you should be using that instead. But these are out there, they're available to use if you need them, so wanted to go over them for you. Now let's talk about the header and footer tags. So these tags are meant to, we just talked about how div and span are sort of anonymous tags. They provide no meaning. The header and footer tags are some of the tags that came along in HTML5 that allowed us to do grouping and sectioning of content, although header and footer are not really meant for or used for sectioning, but sort of grouping blocks together but still giving them meaning. Okay, and so these are elements that we can use to do that. And there's two ways that you can sort of use these, or two primary ways that they get used. And there's a little bit of debate on this. If you look this up online, people debate, and some people say it's only supposed to be this one, or no, it's only supposed to be that one. But if you actually go to the Mozilla Developer Network, which is one of the sort of source materials that are out there for understanding how these things work, you'll see that both of these are used. So it can be used in both ways. So the first one is probably a common one that you've seen, is for a web page. You'll see a header tag like this, and then inside of that you might see something like this, and see like page title, and you may see something like you may see a nav inside of this, or you may see a logo or something along those lines. But the usage here is this being meant as a page header. It's a header for the page. So that's the first usage. The other one that you will see a lot, and we haven't talked about this element yet, but we will, but inside of something like an article tag like this, and you will see a header like this, and this would be maybe post, and actually let's go ahead and do H3, and you might see something like post title like this. And so you have header as sort of the page header, but you also have it as the content or the article header here, and then you maybe see something like div class, or I think there's even main class equals main like this, and this would be like body content, and then down here is where you would see footer, and you know this would be post, or I guess we use post, so post footer, and then you could still see down here something like this, which would be footer, and this would be your page footer. Okay, so it can be used in both contexts, and the idea here is to, again, in our markup, give meaning to the layout of what we're doing here. So we're telling any search engine or anything that reads this, or other developers and so forth, we're saying we have a header section, and by the context of where it's at, it will make sense that this is the header for the page, but it can also be used inside of this article tag as the header for the article, or and the footer for the article. But these are block level elements, and so they will display just like a div does. A block level element, essentially, you see how they're all on new lines. It's essentially like having a built-in sort of line break, and so they will display like that in most modern web browsers. So, but again, just a way of grouping, or I don't want to say sectioning because there's a specific section tag for that, but a way of sort of grouping together pieces of content, or pieces of text, or pieces of our page in a more semantic way than just using divs. Pre-HTML5, all of this would have been done with a div, and it would have been, you probably have seen a ton of this. It would have been div and then class equals, and it would be header like this. Right? That's pretty much how this was done. We've now moved away from that to now we can just do header. And you could still do class equals header. You'll probably see this a decent amount, where they'll do header class equals header or whatever like that. But we now have the actual tags with the proper names, so we can write our markup a little more semantically like this. Let's talk about the section, nav, and article elements now. So we'll start off with the section element, and to create it, it is what you would imagine, something like this. And that will create the section here. Of course, you can give this a class and ID as you could any other HTML element. And this element is used to represent a standalone section, which doesn't have a more specific semantic element to represent it. So what that means, for example, and this is the example that comes straight from the MDN, but I think it's a good one. And the example is a navigation menu should be wrapped in nav, and we'll talk about nav in a second, because that is a specific element. We have something for that, so we use that instead of using section. But a list of, say, search results or a map that you might display on a page, we don't have a map HTML element, or we don't have a search or search result HTML tag that we can use. So if we wanted to display those would make sense inside of a section like this. So that's what section is used for. And generally, it's not required, but generally each section should be identified with some sort of heading. So inside of it, you will generally want to put something like this, and you might do, like, say, map, okay, to give the proper outline to your HTML document and identify what this section is about, because it is not semantically, it doesn't give us any sort of information. It's just a more generic tag. We need to specify what this particular section is about. And so usually you're going to have some sort of tag inside of it, or some sort of heading inside of it that does that. Also, if it doesn't make sense to separately syndicate the content of a section element, then you would use the article element instead. And finally, you don't want to use the section element as a generic container. That's what div is for, especially if you're only doing it for styling purposes. So, and the rule of thumb, again, from the MDN is that a section should logically appear in the outline of a document. So if you think of your document as your tags as sort of the outline for your document, the section would appear in that outline, whereas a div that you're using purely for styling purposes, you wouldn't want it showing up in the outline for that document. So it's something to keep in mind with your use of section. One other thing is that there's no sort of hard, fast rule about, and this is where we'll get into some of the debate. There's a lot of debate around this markup, or there can be, but you can have sections outside of articles. So you can have articles inside of a section. So you may have a section that is, let's say you have a newspaper, you may have a sports section, and then inside that have articles. But you can also have sections inside of articles as well. So you can have an article, and then one of the sections in there could be like technical information or something like that. So you can have articles inside of sections. You can have sections inside of articles. You can have sections inside of other sections. You know, a lot of people will try to tell you that there are hard, fast rules for this stuff. But when we look at the definitions of how they're supposed to be used, there's actually, you don't quite have that, and there's a little bit more flexibility with all of that. So just keep that in mind as you're working with all of this, that there's a little bit more flexibility than a lot of people have you believe. All right, so that's section. The next one we have is nav. So in order to do nav, we just type, as you would guess, nav like this. And then inside of this, you would put your links. And this is, of course, used to represent a navigation menu, or a navigation area with links to different parts of the site. Now, the thing to keep in mind is this is not just for menus. Menus is one of the ways that it can be used, probably the more common way, but it also could be used for, say, a table of contents. It could be used if you're writing a post and you have sections within that post that you want to link to. You can use nav to encapsulate those links at, say, the top of your article. So you could have a nav menu, you could have an article tag, and then within your article tag, you could have another nav. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind with that. It's not necessary that all links be contained inside of nav. It's really only intended for major blocks of navigation links. So one example, again, that's using the MDN that's sort of interesting is a lot of times a footer element will have a list of links. Well, those don't need to be in the nav element. Again, a lot of people out there will sort of say or insinuate that every piece of navigation has to be within the nav tag, and that's not necessarily the case. One of the big things with this is that browsers or user agents, things like screen readers, for disabled users can use this element to determine whether to admit the initial rendering of the navigation-only content. So that's a big use of this, and that's something to keep in mind when you're using this, is browsers will use this to determine whether or not to display or render this content for screen readers and things like that. So once you have your nav element, then you'll see a number of different ways this is used. One, you'll see some people just drop in links like this, which you can certainly do. Probably a more common one is to use an unordered list like this, and then to drop your links inside of that like this. Okay, and so that's a pretty common usage of this. It's really sort of up to you. I probably see this the most. I think Bootstrap 4 now has it where they have examples where they actually, I think they do both, but they have a lot of examples where they just drop in links like this now, which is something I don't remember in Bootstrap 3. But anyway, you can sort of put your links in here how you want, but you want to contain them inside of this nav element. All right, the last one here then is this article element. And actually, let me go ahead and drop these back in here just so we have those. All right, and so the article element is, it represents a self-contained composition in a document. So it's intended to be independently distributable or reusable, so it can be syndicated in and of itself. So this is how you say to anything that may use this, an RSS or a search engine or anything that may look at this document and want to syndicate it, you say essentially when you use an article tag, this is by itself independently redistributable or can be syndicated. This can be put out by itself somewhere else. It could be pulled from the RSS feed and used somewhere else, etc. So again, that's what you're specifying when you use this article tag. So you want to make sure the content that you're putting in there fits that. So it could be a forum post, a magazine or newspaper article, a blog entry, etc. Now, a given document can have multiple articles in it. So for example, on the blog that shows the text of each article, one after the other as they scroll. So like a blog feed, each post would be contained inside of an article element. And there could be more sections inside of that and so forth. Some of the usage notes on this, each article should be identified typically using a heading tag. So again, inside of this, you're generally going to want to have, some sort of heading tag with the post title or article title or whatever the case may be with this. When an article element is nested, the inner element represents an article related to the outer element. So for example, the comments of a blog post can be article elements nested in the article representing the blog post. So you could have, once you have this, then you could have, say, something like, let's just do div, or really it'd be probably section ID equals comments like this, and then each comment could be an article like that. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind when you're using article. They can be nested. Also, author information of an article can be provided through the address element, which we've talked about, but it doesn't apply to nested article elements. So you could come down here and put something like this, address, and that would be the contact information for this individual article. You can also use the publication date and time of an article to give the date and time of this particular article as well. So again, as I mentioned, the article is meant for content or information that can be independently distributable, can be put out there sort of by itself. It's sort of its own self-contained thing. It should have a title. You can nest sections within it. You can nest it within sections. You can nest other article items inside of it if that makes sense, and so forth. So again, these three are some of the main ones that you're going to work with when you are working with semantic go to HTML5 markup, and you'll find a lot of debate and misinformation out there on the web about these, but I wanted to give you sort of what the source material says, sort of my own experience using them, and some different ways that can be used, and hopefully clear up some misconceptions about these. Now let's talk about the aside element. So the aside element is used to represent a portion of a document whose content is only indirectly related to the document's main content, and these are frequently presented as sidebars or call out boxes. All right, so what does that mean? So first off, the tag is like this, aside, and it is for content that is indirectly related to the document's main content. So there's two ways you can really do this. You can do this inside of an article tag like this, or some other section or whatever. You'll commonly see it used inside of an article tag like this, and you'll have something, you maybe have some content here that says, we played Fortnite last night. And in the aside, what you would put is, you may put something like, Fortnite is a game by Epic Games. Okay, and then you would continue on with your content down here, an article that says, I don't know, we had fun. Okay, so what this aside is, it really is an aside. It's something that's indirectly related. So you're talking about Fortnite, but it's not, this isn't necessary to the main thrust of what you're writing in this article. So it's an aside. So that's how you would use this. There's one instance of how you would use this. Another really common one that you'll see is, as the sort of the MDN mentions, is you'll see it used as a sidebar. So you may have this article element here, and then you may have something over here outside of the article element that says aside. And a lot of times you'll see something like ID equals sidebar, just like this. And then inside of this, you will have, section class equals, I'm just doing this to make it a little bit more explicit. So you'll have individual widgets like this, and you'll be widget 1, and then you'll have some sort of, content inside of here like this. Okay. So the aside is an aside to the article as a whole, whereas this aside is to this, really to this particular sentence. And you could do this, you could do this again and be like, aside, fun is a thing people have. Like, you could do multiple asides like this within a particular article if they make sense. Whereas this one here is really an aside to the article or to the page as a whole. So, and it's being used as a sidebar. Now, when this all sort of first came out, this was a little bit debated, and if you go online, you'll see people sort of debating back and forth. And then some of the source material was updated to clarify and actually put in the words, asides are frequently presented as sidebars or call out boxes, like to say explicitly in the source material and documentation that using it as an aside as a sidebar is legitimate, and then using sections within that this is sort of kind of become the recommended or more standard way that people tend to do this now. It's have the sidebar as an aside and then have sections within that. So that's something to keep in mind as you're working with all of this, but that is what an aside is and how you use it. Next is the time tag. So the time element or tag represents a specific period in time. It can include a date time attribute to translate whatever the human readable date is into a machine readable format, which will allow search engines to read it better, or other custom features that maybe in browsers or things that are out there, like a calendar can read it and be able to add that to your calendar easily. So really the whole idea of the time tag is to wrap a human readable date time inside of it, and then add the date time attribute to it so that machines can also read it. So it's readable by humans and also readable by machines. There's other uses of it, but I would say that's sort of the main way in my experience that you'll see it being used. Now, it can represent time on a 24-hour clock. It can represent a precise date in the Gregorian calendar. It can also represent a valid time duration. So like 2 hours and 15 minutes or whatever. So to write the time tag, you'll do just something like this. And then you could specify a specific date inside of this, a human readable date. So you could say July 12th, like this. And then you would add the date time attribute, and you would make this machine readable. So you might do something like 2018-07-12. Okay, so this is the human readable part that humans will see, but this is added to it so that machines can read it. And I mean, that's really sort of the main thrust of what you do with this. You can also use it, so you'll see some examples like this, like the party started at, and then you'll see time, and you'll see, this is a common one. You'll see something like this. So you're specifying a time. So you can, again, one of the ways that you can use this is for time on a 24-hour clock. So this is how you would use it in that sense. And then you can also use it for durations. And so you can say the party will last, and then you do time, and you can do, say, 1 hour and 30 minutes. Okay. And so this, again, makes it so that you're sort of calling out this time. And in this sense, because of the way this is structured and formatted, a machine can still read this. It can still read this. And for something like this, where it's a little bit harder for it to read, you can specify the date time attribute so that it can still read it. So you're presenting human readable dates and times to the human, but you're also presenting it in a way where it can be read by machines. Now, one thing with the date time attribute is you do have to use valid date time values. So I'm just going to drag this over here for you to see, but these are the valid date time values. If you're unsure, I just recommend that you go to the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, look this stuff up, and you can see there's a number of options here. So a year string, a month string, date, a week, time, etc. You can sort of see all what's available inside of here. So that would be my recommendation if you're unsure of what formats actually are acceptable for this date time. But again, that's sort of the point, to present a human readable, but also make it machine readable and make it more useful for machines that might be reading a particular document. So that's it for the time tag. Next up is abbreviations and quotes. So for abbreviations, you do something like this, and you would have your abbreviation be human readable. So, we could do something like ABC like this. And then you can add the parameter title and hit this title equals, and then you would actually sort of spell out what the abbreviation is. So I think it's American Broadcasting Company, something like that. Right, so that's going to have the abbreviation was what you see, and then when you hover over it like this, you'll see the actual full abbreviation. So abbreviations, acronyms, all that, this is what you want to use in order to do that. So that one's pretty straightforward, nothing super fancy there. The next one is quotes. There's actually, most people probably know about block quote, but there's actually two that you can use for this. So the first one is block quote. And block quote is intended for something where you're quoting something from another source. Okay, so you might just say quote goes here, and then you want to cite it. And so you have a parameter that you can add here, the cite equals, and or an attribute is really, so you cite equals, and then you would cite where this comes from. So whatever, http www.google.com, let's just say, wherever that quote is actually coming from, then you would cite that here, and that would create that quote, and you'd have the citation in there and all of that. So that would be how to properly do something with a block quote. What we probably use quotes more for is more of these inline quotes where we're maybe just emphasizing something. So for that, you would actually use the quote, the Q tag. And so you might say something like this, what I said was, and then you would, you would use the Q tag here. So you'd come down here maybe and like do this, and hi, how are you? And that would be how you use that Q tag, okay? And so so that's a little bit different than maybe what you might see out there in terms of doing quotes and so forth. But when you have something to cite, you want to use that block quote. And when you just have something where you want to sort of add some emphasis to it or whatever, then you would use hi, how are you? And you notice here that it automatically puts the quotes around that when you use that Q tag. Okay. So again, those are all pretty straightforward, but that's abbreviations and quotes. Now it's the moment you've probably been waiting for. We can get into some of the more well-known or sought-after tags. The first one being the audio element. And the audio element allows you to embed audio into a web page. Now, to give you a sort of an overview of this, I'll just open a new browser tab here, and I'm going to paste in a URL. Let me click down here so you can see the URL. But let's draw this down a little bit. So this is the URL here, and this is normally if you visit a URL like this, this is a straight audio MP3 file. You'll get something like this. The browser will sort of have its own way of trying to play that audio or whatever. So that's just visiting a file directly. Now what we want to do is we want to embed this into a web page so it can play inline, and that's what the audio tag allows us to do. Again, this is something new, came out with HTML5 that we can now use. Right, so it's pretty straightforward tag. We just start with audio like this, and it's an opening and closing tag, and then inside of it you're going to have another tag called source, and you're going to then set the src, which stands for source, equal to the URL of the audio file you want to play. So in our case, this is the one that I just was playing directly in our browser. So we're going to set that as the source, and we're going to set the type and tell it what type of audio file it is. So in this case, it is audio, and it is an MP3. Okay, so whatever it happens to be in your particular case. Now, one of the things that you can do with this is you can have multiple source elements. So you could do something like this. You could source equals, and let's just do my audio. This doesn't exist, but let's do something like this, an OGG file. And then you would be, of course, do type audio / OGG like this. So this is just a different type of audio file, and what the browser will do is it'll go through each one of these elements, and you can have as many as you want, and it'll try to play each one. So if it can't play the MP3, then it'll go to the next one, try to play the OGG file. If it can't play the OGG file, it'll go to the next one and the next one and the next one until it finds one that it can play. So it'll play the first one that it's able to. And so this allows you to, this is how you can have your audio files be compatible on a bunch of different devices and so forth. Now, if it goes through all of those source files and it can't play any of them, then you can put in text like this and say something like, sorry, couldn't play the file. And you could just have an error message like that, or you can make it like super helpful and say, visit the link directly, and actually put a direct link to the file in this little text area here. like that. And so what happens is if the browser goes through and it can't play any of these source files, then it will display whatever text you have directly inside of this audio tag. So it'll display, sorry, couldn't play the file, visit the link directly, and then it'll create a link to that file. They can click it directly, or they can right click and download. So it gives you sort of a way to handle all of those different situations. One of the other things that is sort of common that you want to do here is say whether you want to have controls or not. So if you put this controls word in here, then if that attribute is present, the browser will present the controls to allow the user to control the audio file. Otherwise, it won't. So that's one of the many attributes that you can use here. Let me go ahead and do this to save that. And the last thing with this is, again, as with a lot of these, there's a lot of different attributes that you can do with this. So let me just sort of drag over. Again, this is the MDN, Mozilla Developer Network. You can see there's autoplay, there's controls, cross origin, loop, muted, preload, which will preload it, of course, the source. All of these different attributes that you can apply to this if you want to do those particular things. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, I highly recommend looking at the source material. When you want to know what something does, what a tag does, go to the MDN, look at the source material, see what the specification says. That's usually the best place to find that information. So that's a quick rundown of the audio tag and how it works in HTML. Next up is the video tag, which is a lot like the audio tag, and this allows you to embed video inline into your HTML page. So again, getting started with is pretty straightforward. It's just video like this, and then again you have a source elements that you can add, so sort or attribute source like this, and you're going to again specify the source of the video you want to have played here. Now I'll come over here to my workspace, and I've just got a couple videos over here that I've put in here, and so we'll just reference those real quick. So they're in videos, and then let's just do 1212.mp4 like this, and then we're going to again tell it what type of video this is. So it's video/mp4 like that. Okay, and that is the source element. And again, you can do multiple ones and it'll fall back and all of that, just like the audio tag. So you could have one down here that was source. And it could be, my video.web m type equals video/web m like that. So you could do that again. Of course, and you can also specify then inside of this, inside of the tag here, again, if you want controls. Another one that you would probably want to specify up here is height and width. So we could do something like width equals 640 and height equals 360. Like this. And so that'll give you a width and height for it. And of course, we also have the fallback. If you can't play any of the files, you can specify that here. Okay, so that's sort of the basic usage of the video tag. It allows you again to embed any sort of video into an HTML page like this. It's going to take the first element. Let's add an S here. It's going to take the first frame and use that as a poster image, or you can specify a poster image in it if you want to as well. So that's another thing that you can specify in terms of attributes for your videos. And the way to do that would just, again, in this area right here, let's go ahead and clean this up. You would just specify, and actually you can drop these down, makes it a little bit easier to read, and you can do poster equals and then just the URL to the image that you want to use. I don't happen to have one on hand here, so we'll just stick with it like this. But you can specify that image. Another thing that you'll want to keep in mind is a lot of times you may want to add captions. So you'll see over here I have this 1212-captions.vtt. So we'll go ahead and click that open real quick. And now WebVTT is just, it's a specification for how you can write subtitles. So you can see right here from 1 second to 4 seconds, this is the subtitle that's displayed. From 6.5 seconds to 9 seconds, this is the subtitle. And you can just add the subtitles as you want going through your video. So this is a particular way of doing this. I believe there's multiple ways you can do this, although I think this one's pretty common. So again, if you want to specify captions, you first create this file, and then once that file is created, you'll come back over here, and then after your source elements here, before your sort of fallback, you would use the track attribute. So you'd do track, and then you would say label equals English. So these are English subtitles. Kind equals subtitles. And then you would do the source language equals EN. So that's the designator for English. And then you would do source equals and then where they're located. So again, in here it'd be videos, and it would be 1212-captions.vtt, like that. That's where they are actually located. And then you can specify that these are the default. Okay, and so that's the track attribute. I'll go ahead and close that up. And that will allow us to specify the subtitles for this particular video. Okay, and so then we can play this, and you'll see that we get, this is the first subtitle, and then eventually as it goes and plays here, you get this is the second, so that's the second subtitle, and that is what I wrote over here. And of course you can write whatever you want there. So that is how you handle accessibility and subtitles with the video tag as well. All right, now what I want to do is a little sort of CSS and JavaScript primer, and maybe help you sort of transition over into those two languages if that's what you're going to do next, which is of course what I recommend. Now I'm going to give you a couple files. I'm going to go through one of these, but the first one is this video.html. That's the one we're going to go ahead and build here. I have another one called audio.html. You can see here I've went ahead and built that out for you. The two files are very, very similar, as we've talked about with the audio and video tag. They're actually very, very similar. So the two files work very, very similar, but I wanted to give you this audio one as well so you could use that as sort of an example. But we're going to build this video one here. The other thing I want to show you is I've created a folder called videos, and I've just put 3 videos in it. These all just have sort of numbers to them. We're going to be referencing them in our code, but those are in our videos folder here. All right, so go ahead and close that up. So what we want to go ahead and do then is we want to go inside our body, and we're going to create, first off, we're just going to create our video player here. So I'm going to create a div with an ID equal to video player. We're going to need this for our CSS later. And this is going to be sort of a wrapper for our entire video player. Then we're going to do video player, or a video tag, and we're going to give that an ID of equal to player. And then we are going to include controls on that, and we'll go ahead and close that up. You can see that sort of pops in a video player here. So we have sort of a rudimentary beginning of what we're going to do here. And then I am going to put in a source element like this, or a source attribute, and I'm going to set the source here actually blank for now. And we'll get to why that is here in just a minute. And then we'll set the type equal to video/MP4, because we know we're going to be using all MP4 players. Now with the JavaScript that we're going to use here, you could populate the type as well and get into all of that, but I don't want to go too deep into all of this just because this is going to be a little bit brand new and we haven't obviously gone through JavaScript or CSS. So we're just going to leave that at video/MP4, source empty, and then we're going to put in our default message here if it doesn't support the video tag. So your browser doesn't support the video player. Just something simple like that. We're not going to do anything crazy here. All right, the next thing that we're going to do then is we're going to build a playlist. So we're going to build an unordered list, and we're going to give that an ID equal to playlist, like this. And we're going to put in our actual source items that we're going to populate in here using this list here. Okay, so we do list item class equal to current. So the first one's going to be the current one when we load the page. And then inside of this, we're going to have an anchor tag. And we are going to then set this to the different videos that we have in our folder. So videos /12 12.mp4. And we're just going to call this video number 1. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and then copy all of this and paste that down here because this is all going to be very similar. And for a second, we're actually going to get rid of the class current like that. And for a second video, then the URL is going to be 2858, and this will be video number 2. And then get rid of the current here. And our last video is 5005, and this will be video number 3. All right, so we have a basic setup here. We have our player, and we have a playlist here. Now what we need to do is we need to use JavaScript to help this work, or to play these different items when we click on them. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here right before a closing body tag, and we are going to include jQuery because we're going to be using jQuery, which is a JavaScript library framework that helps make working with JavaScript a lot easier. I recommend using something like it. Doesn't have to be jQuery, but some sort of framework like that. All right, so once we've got that included, now we can access jQuery methods and so forth. And so we're going to open a new script tag like this, and inside of that, then we are going to write the JavaScript that, or the jQuery that allows us to make all of this work. So we are going to write a function called video player, and in that we're going to pass in an element. We'll talk about that in just a second. And we're going to write all of our functionality inside of that, and then to invoke that function to say, hey, I want to use this function, we are going to call it here. So we'll just say, put out the name of the function, and then we are going to pass in the element that we want this to apply to. So we're going to pass in video player like this. And if you remember from up here, our div tag, this is referencing this. So this is one of the first things with jQuery JavaScript is that much like with the little bit of CSS we've done, you are referencing elements that you've given IDs or classes to in your HTML. So we're telling this function that the element that we want to manipulate inside of our function is this video player element here. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we go through this. This EL is now sort of a placeholder for this element right here. Every time we use EL, it's going to be referencing this element here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an element like this, and this essentially turns this into a jQuery object that we can then use and manipulate. This is just sort of something you have to do when you're working with jQuery, is you need it as a jQuery object. Otherwise, it's just sort of the raw tag itself, and you can't apply functions to it. Again, as you get deeper into JavaScript and jQuery, that will probably make a little more sense. But now we want to reference our player, the actual player itself. So this is going to be equal to, and we're going to use our L variable that we just created. We're going to use a method called children, and what we're going to look for in that is our element with an ID of player. Okay, so what this is doing right here is this essentially right here is saying, this is a new variable we're creating. It's going to be called player, and it is going to reference whatever element gets passed in. We're going to look in the children. So everything right here, this video and this unordered list, are the direct children of this parent tag here. So we're going to look for the children, and we're going to look for the one named player. So now this player variable is referencing this tag right here. Okay, so that's the first thing we need. And then the next thing we need is the playlist, and it's really the same idea. So we're going to do l.children, our element, and inside of that now we're going to look for playlist like this. Oh, need our quotes here. Playlist. All right. So now we have three variables. We have our overall parent element, which is video player. We have our player, which is just the video tag. And now we have our playlist, which is just this unordered list right here. So now we can reference these inside the rest of our function here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to autoplay the first track when this page loads. So I'm going to put in a comment there so we know what we're doing here. And this part is a little bit tricky. I'll try to explain this to you, but this is something that you want to, obviously, as you get into JavaScript and jQuery, it'll make a little more sense. Okay, so we're doing player, and then we're doing this zero, sort of these brackets with the zero. This is referencing an index. Okay, so when you start working with arrays, and an array is essentially sort of a list of different items, and when you have an indexed array, what that means is the way that it is denoted, each item in that list is using a number. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And in PHP, JavaScript, most code, that it's going to be zero based, meaning the first element in that array is going to be 0, the first number, not 1, as you would expect, okay? So when we do this right here and we get this player object right here, what this actually does is it gives us a collection of all of the items that match this sort of, I want to call it a query, but this designation here that match this. The selector is the proper word. So there's a collection that was created. Now we only have one item in it, but it is still a collection. And so we need to reference the one that's at the very first index, which happens to be the only one in it, but still we need to reference it. So this is referencing, this player 0 here is referencing this video tag right here. If we had multiple video tags in here, we could do player 0, player 1, player 2, etc. and we would reference the different video tags as they appear in the source code, top to bottom, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind here with this as we go through this. And actually, I've just noticed this big red mark over here. I need to put this in quotes here as well. All right, so now what we want is we want the source attribute. So this source attribute here, we want to manipulate that. So we're going to set that equal to, and then we are going to reference our playlist, and now we're going to use a find method, and we are going to do, so our playlist is the unordered list. Now we want to do the list item, and we want to do A, and again, which is, okay, the list item, the A tag, and now we're going to reference the one at the 0 index again, because remember, we have now in this one, we actually have 3 different list items. So we're only doing list item A, and that's going to grab all 3 of these. Well, we just want the first one, so we're just going to autoplay the first track, okay? So that's what this does. It sets, now what actually happens here is when this line runs here, it actually sets this source element here. It takes this href tag here and it essentially injects it in here. Okay, so now instead of being empty, it will have that URL in it. Okay, so that's what that does. And now we're just going to do player. I'm going to do 0 again because that's the one we want, dot play. All right, so let's go ahead and give this a whirl and see if it actually works here. And it's reloading here, taking a second. And it seems like my server might be having a few issues, but this also is wrong here. We need to set that equal to and do that. So we'll go ahead and save that. And let's refresh this. All right, so my server was having a few issues there, but you can see now, once I fix that error, now whenever this page loads, if I reload this, this will go ahead and play this here, okay? So that is giving us our autoplay. So that's the first thing that we want is and of course you don't have to do that, but that's just what I happen to be doing here is I'm going to autoplay that first track when the page loads. All right. Now the next thing that we want to do is we want to click to play a track. And this is where we get into sort of most of the code here. So we are going to, again, reference our playlist element or our playlist tag, and we're going to use a method called on. And this is something that you use a lot, in particular with jQuery. And on can be used in a lot of different ways. It can be, we're going to use on click, you can use on mouse over, there's all the different events that someone could do in terms of interacting with a web page with their mouse or even their keyboard, whatever. Anything that they could do in terms of interacting with the page, this on element can reference that. Okay, so first we need to tell it what event we want to deal with. So we're going to do click, so on click, and then what are we clicking? What event or what item are we going to be looking at? So on click LIA. Remember, we're referencing our playlist element, so our unordered list LIA. So whenever we click one of these links, okay, that's what we've said so far, then we want to run this function, which is a custom function that we are going to write. Okay, so this is sort of what's called an anonymous function. You notice how here we have function and this one has a name. This one here does not have a name. These are used all the time in JavaScript, jQuery. They're anonymous functions like this that you sort of put right into another method here. Okay, so we're creating this function as we're telling this method this is the function we want to use. This is very, very common in JavaScript, jQuery, etc. So, and this E right here is referencing event. We'll need that for the first thing that we're going to do here, which is we are going to prevent the default link click action. So the first thing we want to do, these are, again, hyperlinks. So right now, if you click one of these, it's going to take you to that particular video. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and prevent that from happening. We don't want that to do that. And so we are going to, and I clicked that link, so now my server may be having some issues here again. But we're going to do e.prevent. My server's having a few issues here. All right, e.prevent default. And so what this is going to do is this is going to prevent that default link click action. Okay, so now when you click this link, as of right now, because we haven't written anything else, it's not going to do anything. So that stops that from linking to the actual file at this point. All right, so once we've got that, now we're going to set up some variables that we're going to need. So the first one that we're going to set up is one called this. And this is equal to something this, okay? So it looks like this. This looks probably pretty confusing. I know the first time I saw it, I was like, what in the world? But this code right here where you do the $, parentheses, and then this inside of it, what this is doing is this is a shortcut for the item that was clicked. So whichever one of these we click, that inside of our function here and inside of this anonymous function, that's what's going to be referenced by this. You do this all the time because essentially what's going to happen is whatever link is clicked, we're going to want to get the source for that particular link and populate it into the source item up here. So instead of having to come in and try and figure out which one was clicked and reference, you can just use this. So that's the item that was clicked. This means this item that was clicked. And so this is going to reference this A tag, each one of these A tags, whichever one happens to be clicked anytime one of them is clicked. Now what we're doing here by creating this variable is this is just for performance. We're saving this variable so that we can then use it later inside of our function instead of having to constantly call this, because this actually searches through the DOM to find what was clicked and so forth, and there's a performance hit there. Okay, so this is just, again, something that's going to help us performance wise. All right, and now I'm going to hit current equals 0. What that's saying is that this variable current that we're creating here is set to 0. What that means is we're actually referencing this list item here, which remember this is 0 based. We have that in a collection, so it's 0 based. So we're referencing that first list item here. We're going to be using that later. All right, now we want to play track on click. So we're going to play whatever track was clicked, and so we are going to do player, sort of like we did before, 0, and we're going to do dot source. And we're going to set that equal to our this. So this reference the element that was clicked. And we're going to do adder, stands for attribute, href. Okay. So what this is saying is in our player, which is our video tag up here, we want to set the source of that equal to whatever link was clicked. That's this. And the attribute href. So this href right here. So if this link is clicked, we're going to set source equal to this href. If this link is clicked, we're going to set source equal to this href. If this one is clicked, we're going to set source equal. So that's what this is saying right here. That's the point that we're trying to get to. And then what we want to do again is we want to do player 0 dot play. And we want to automatically play that new thing whenever it's clicked. Okay, so let me go ahead and save this. And so now let me click video 2, and that is going to, you come back here and reload this. All right, so let me go video 2, and that's playing video 2 now. We go video 3, and as soon as video 3 loads, then that plays video 3. And we'll talk about, you notice the videos are starting off small and then they're getting big. We'll fix that here in just a second, but you can see now based off of this, whatever video clicks, it starts auto playing here. All right, so that is the basic functionality. Now we just want to do some sort of final fine touches. So we want to remove the current class from this first element, because this one auto plays, but when we click this one's now the current, or this one, it's now the current. So the first thing we need to do is we need to just remove that class from whatever it happens to be on at the moment. So we're going to remove class from li elements, and we're just going to remove it whenever something is clicked. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to remove it from all of them. Okay, so we're going to playlist find, we're going to do li. So we're going to find all the list item elements, and we're going to do remove class and current. So we're going to remove the class named current, and we're just removing it from all of them because it really should only be on one of them, but instead of worrying about trying to find exactly which one it is, just remove it from all of them because we're going to add it back here in just a second. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to do add class to current playlist item. All right, so current now is going to be set equal to, and we're going to do this. Remember, this references the anchor tag that was clicked. So we're going to do parent, which is now giving us the list item of the anchor tag that was clicked, and we're going to do the index number. Okay, so remember 0, 1, 2. So we set it to 0 because that's what it is by default. But now we want to get the index of whichever one was clicked. So that's what current is set to now. And then we're going to do this dot parent, and we're going to do add class, and we're going to add current like this. Okay, so this is going to then add that current class to the parent class of whatever was clicked. Okay, so that's how we then add and remove that class from whatever item happens to be clicked. Now that's going to come into play when we do our CSS. Okay, so this is just some fine tuning, but basically whenever we click one of these links, the list item that we click is going to have the class current added to it, and all the other ones will have it removed. Okay, so that is the jQuery. Don't get too freaked out if this doesn't make a ton of sense right off the bat. This is something that, you know, is probably a little bit, I don't want to say it's advanced, but this is not the first thing that a lot of people do with jQuery or JavaScript. But I really want to throw you sort of into the fire to help you get your feet wet and have some sense. And then when you go to take, you know, some other course or tutorial on this, it'll be a little bit hopefully easier for you. All right, so now that we have that done, then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and style this. So I'm going to set the video player, and I'm going to do max width and 700 pixels. That's just something that I decided on. And we're going to do margin. We're going to do 35 pixels and auto, like this. Okay, and then we're going to come down and we're going to do the player, and we're going to set the actual player width equal to 100% of its container, which is this video player element here. So now the width is going to stretch that 700 pixels here. And we do that because when we get to the playlist, you'll see we sort of do the same thing. And then we're going to do height auto. And so the player itself, the video player, is going to be 100% of whatever container it is, and then the height is going to adjust itself. So if we change this to 800, you see the video gets bigger. If we changed it to 200, 200, you see the video gets smaller. It adjusts with whatever we change this to, and the height adjusts automatically with it. Okay, so that's just one sort of way of doing this with the CSS. Now we're going to style the playlist. And the first thing we're going to style is the actual unordered list element itself. So we're going to do margin. We're going to set 15 pixels on the top, create a margin across the top. Then we're going to do 0, 0, 0. And then we are going to do padding 0. And then we are going to do list style type none. And that gets, you see how now we got rid of the bullets, we moved over, got rid of all of the padding that was pushing these over, and that gives us a list that we can then sort of a starting point that we can start messing with this list a little bit. Now we're going to actually style the list items, which is where most of the code is. And we're going to do A, and we are going to, these are just sort of stuff that I came up with, but I'm going to set the color to sort of a grayish color, which is 555. So you see the links just change color. We're going to display these as block elements because anchor tags by default are inline elements. So we're going to display them as block because we're going to then be adding some sort of design and styling to them. Do margin, bottom, and we'll do -1 pixels like this. And we'll do text decoration none, like that. And then we'll do padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels. You see that gives us a little bit of space around our elements. We'll do background as white, like that. And then we'll do a border 1 pixel solid, and we'll do F7 like this. So you can see that gives us a little bit sort of a neater looking design here. Obviously it's not necessarily the most fabulous design ever, but it gives you a basic idea of how to style this. All right, now we're going to style whatever the current item is. So we're going to do playlist, and we're going to do li.current, and we're going to do A. And now what we'll do here is we'll set the background. Actually, let's just set the color. And we'll set the color to 222. So that one, that'll be a little bit different color than the default color, which is the 555. Okay, and then the last thing that we're going to do here is we are going to, now this is a little bit more of an advanced thing with CSS, but we're going to add some content. So we're going to do playlist, and we're going to do li.current a, and then we're going to do before. And so this essentially allows us to insert stuff before the tag, the text in the tag. And so we're going to do content, and we're going to do now playing. And you'll see as I'm typing that, it's inserting it before this element here. So that's what that allows us to do. And then I'm going to do font style italic like this. So now we have this now playing sort of thing here. Let me just refresh this here. So when the video loads, you see it's now playing. If I click video 2, that one is now playing. Video 3, that one is now playing. Okay. And of course you could go through here and do some more sophisticated styling here, but this gives us sort of a decent little kind of playlist. It actually works. There's a little bit of styling to it. And you're pretty much good to go at that point. So that is really hot and heavy, kind of fast and quick look at sort of an introduction to CSS and JavaScript. Is not meant for you to understand all of it. It's really more to challenge you to now dive into this stuff since you've been through the HTML course, dive into CSS, dive into JavaScript, and start here. And if you can get this working, then you can be confident that you'll be able to tackle CSS and JavaScript. So try and do this by yourself at first. Obviously use the code as you need to, because that's all brand new to you, but try and actually build this and get this working and go through this and understand how it works and how changing different parts changes things and so forth, and try to get your head around it. And again, it's meant as a challenge, not as you're supposed to know how to do this. So that'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time. All right, for the class project here, what I want to do is I want to give you another challenge. So what I've done is I've gone through and I've created this site that you see here in front of you. And this isn't necessarily the most sophisticated thing, but it does use a lot of CSS. If you come over here, you'll see there's quite a bit of CSS over here. And the reason I wanted to do that is because really after you've learned HTML, CSS is the next thing that you should dive into. And so I want you to sort of look through this code, and as your class project, take this on as a challenge of learning this code and sort of how this is built and what does what. And I'm not going to walk through and show you this. I really want you to take this as a challenge for yourself and sort of dive into this and figure this out and build something similar to this, and then post that as your class project so I can take a look at it and leave you any feedback and see how you did, and really just sort of celebrate you diving into it and getting it done. So again, take this as another challenge for you to dive into and sort of get your feet wet with CSS. There's a ton of it here to learn from, and one of the best things that you can do in order to learn coding is to look at other people's code. Now, keep in mind, I'm not presenting this as the absolute perfect or only way to do this. In fact, I did this specifically, avoided things that we did not talk about inside of the course outside of this responsive part here. I just couldn't give you a site that wasn't responsive, but responsive design is really heavily in CSS. But everything else that's in here is sort of pretty standard. Kind of, I kept it basic to CSS. Didn't get into anything with Flexbox or CSS Grid or any of that. I wanted to give you sort of just raw, straight CSS. So this is a good way to learn some of that stuff and see that you can do things that way. And then when you get into those other things, they make a little bit more sense. Anyway, again, as your class project, take this as a challenge, go through this, learn this, and try to build this as much as you can on your own, or just build it a couple times and get to the point where you can build it on their own. However you want to do it, but again, challenge yourself with this, and this of course is your class project. To get this code, you'll just go to the class project section, and you'll find all the source code for the course attached there, including this one as well. All right, appreciate you taking the course. Of course, if you want to see all my other courses, get into PHP, you want to learn freelancing, get on Upwork, all that sort of thing, then definitely check out my profile and see all the different courses that I have available, WordPress course, etc. And I look forward to seeing you in those other courses.